Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I am 28 years old. This happened in October 2023. The GPS started glitching about 30 miles out from Lake Fosse Point State Park, the blue dot on my phone's screen stuttering like a dying heartbeat before disappearing entirely. Jake Williams, my hunting partner since high school, laughed from the passenger seat of my battered Ford pickup as he stuffed his phone back into his camo jacket. Technology, man. Can't trust it out here in God's country. He gestured toward the windshield where the asphalt had given way to a narrow dirt road cutting through increasingly dense Louisiana swampland. Ancient cypress trees, their trunks thick as truck tires and draped in Spanish moss, pressed in on both sides like gray-green sentinels. My grandpère used to hunt these woods with nothing but a compass and his instincts. We'll be fine. I wished I shared his confidence. The October heat was oppressive, even with the windows down, and something about the quality of light filtering through the canopy made my skin crawl. It wasn't just the dimness, though the sun barely penetrated the thick weave of branches and moss above us, but the way shadows seemed to move when they shouldn't, shifting and writhing at the edges of my vision. "You sure about this spot?" I asked, navigating around a pothole that looked deep enough to swallow a tire. The park ranger said most people stick to the marked trails near the visitor center. Jake snorted. "That's exactly why we're going deeper. Those weekend warriors scare off anything worth shooting." He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket, unfolding what looked like a hand-drawn map. "My cousin Boudreaux gave me this. Says there's an old hunting camp about 5 miles in from the main trail. Been abandoned for years, but the deer still use the salt licks." The map looked ancient, the pencil marks faded and the paper yellow with age. I caught a glimpse of warnings scrawled in the margins, things like "stay on path" and "avoid the bog," but Jake folded it away before I could read more. We'd been planning this trip for months, ever since Jake lost his job at the chemical plant in Geismar. The unemployment was eating at him, and I figured a few days in the woods might help clear his head. We'd been hunting together since we were teenagers, tramping through the forests around Baton Rouge with our fathers, but we'd never ventured this deep into the Atchafalaya Basin. The road finally ended at a small clearing barely large enough for my truck. Rusted metal signs, bullet-riddled and illegible, hung from chains on nearby trees. The air smelled thick and wet, like rotting vegetation and standing water, with an underlying metallic tang that made my stomach turn. "This is it," Jake announced, shouldering his hunting pack. The thing was massive, stuffed with enough gear for a week in the wilderness even though we'd only planned to stay 3 days. Boudreaux said to follow the Blaze Trail north until we hit the first major bayou, then head east for about 2 miles. I grabbed my own pack, considerably lighter than Jake's, and checked my rifle. A Remington 700 in .30-06, the same one my father had taught me to shoot with. The familiar weight of it should have been comforting, but as we stepped into the tree line, I found myself gripping it tighter than usual. The trail, if it could be called that, was little more than a game path winding between massive tree trunks. Our boots squelched in the soft earth with each step, and more than once I had to duck under low-hanging branches draped with moss that felt like cobwebs against my face. The sound of our footsteps seemed muffled here, absorbed by the thick vegetation, while other sounds, the splash of something large moving through water, the rustle of unseen animals in the underbrush, seemed amplified. "Jesus, it's dark in here," I muttered, checking my watch. Only 3:30 in the afternoon, but it felt like twilight under the canopy. "That's what makes it perfect," Jake replied, though I noticed he'd pulled out a heavy flashlight despite the early hour. "Deer move different when they feel safe. Less pressure from hunters means they stick to their normal patterns." We walked in a relative silence for the next hour. The only sounds are labored breathing and the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. The deeper we went, the wetter the ground became, until we were splashing through ankle-deep water that reflected the filtered sunlight in patches of tarnished silver. The trees grew larger and stranger, their roots forming twisted archways and their trunks bulging with weird growths that looked almost like faces in the dim light. That's when Jake stopped abruptly, his head cocked to one side. "You hear that?" I listened, straining my ears above the sound of my own heartbeat. At first, nothing. Then, faintly, a rhythmic splashing sound like someone walking through water. But it was moving parallel to us, maybe 50 yards to our left, and keeping pace with our movement. "Probably just another hunter," I said, though my voice sounded thin even to my own ears. Jake shook his head slowly. "Boudreaux said nobody else knows about this place. That's the whole point." We stood there for several minutes listening, but the sound had stopped. When we resumed walking, I found myself constantly glancing to the left, searching the shadows between the trees for any sign of movement. It was nearly 5 o'clock when we reached the hunting camp, and I immediately understood why it had been abandoned. The structure, a small cabin raised on stilts above the swamp water, was clearly decades old and in an advanced state of decay. The roof sagged dangerously in the middle, missing several sheets of corrugated metal, and the wooden walls had taken on the gray-green color of rot. Rusted cable stretched between nearby trees, the remnants of what might once have been bridges or walkways. "This is it?" I asked, trying to keep the doubt out of my voice. Jake was already wading through the knee-deep water toward the cabin, his pack held high above his head. "It's perfect, man. Completely isolated. Nobody's going to bother us here." I followed reluctantly, wincing as the cold water soaked through my boots. The cabin supports groaned ominously as Jake climbed the warped ladder to the porch, but they held his weight. By the time I joined him, he was already pushing open the door. Inside was worse than outside. The floorboards were soft with rot, and everything was covered in a thick layer of dust and debris. Ancient hunting magazines mouldered in one corner, their pages warped and illegible. An old kerosene lantern sat on a makeshift table constructed from sawhorses and plywood, its glass chimney black with soot. "Home sweet home," Jake said cheerfully, dropping his pack with a thud that made the entire structure shudder. I set up my sleeping bag as far from the questionable walls as possible, trying to ignore the skittering sounds that came from the shadows whenever we moved around. Jake, meanwhile, seemed energized by our surroundings, unpacking his gear with the enthusiasm of a kid on Christmas morning. "Look at this," he said, pulling an enormous hunting knife from his pack. The blade was at least 8 inches long, serrated on one edge and polished to a mirror finish. "Got it at that military surplus store in New Orleans. Guy said it was designed for field dressing large game." I'd never seen Jake carry a knife that big before. He was more of a practical hunter, preferring to do his butchering back at home where he had proper facilities. But then again, unemployment had changed a lot of things about him. He'd been acting stranger lately, more aggressive, more paranoid about money, more likely to snap at perceived slights. "That's some serious hardware," I said carefully. Jake grinned, testing the edge with his thumb. A thin line of blood appeared where the blade touched his skin. "Sharp enough to shave with." As the sun set, or what passed for sunset in the perpetual twilight of the swamp, the temperature dropped faster than I'd expected. The humidity remained oppressive, but now it carried a chill that seemed to seep into my bones. We ate cold sandwiches and lukewarm coffee from a thermos, neither of us wanting to risk lighting the camp stove inside the questionable cabin. That's when the sounds started. At first, it was just the normal symphony of night in the swamp. Frogs, insects, the occasional splash of something moving through water. But as full darkness settled over us, other noises began to emerge. Low moaning sounds that could have been wind through the trees, except there was no wind. Rhythmic tapping, like someone drumming their fingers on wood. And underneath it all, a sound I couldn't quite identify. A wet, dragging noise as if something large was being pulled through the water around the cabin. "You hearing this?" I whispered to Jake, who was sitting on his sleeping bag methodically cleaning his rifle by the light of a battery-powered lantern. He paused, listening. "Just swamp sounds, man. You've been living in the city too long." But I noticed he double-checked that his rifle was loaded before setting it within easy reach. I tried to sleep, but every time I started to drift off, some new sound would jolt me awake. Around midnight, I heard what sounded distinctly like footsteps on the cabin's roof, moving back and forth in a deliberate pattern. When I sat up to investigate, the sound stopped immediately. "Jake," I whispered. "Jake, wake up." He rolled over, groggy. "What?" "Something's on the roof." We both lay still, listening. Nothing but the usual swamp chorus. "You're paranoid," Jake mumbled, already falling back asleep. "Go to sleep." But I remained awake for hours, staring at the sagging ceiling and jumping at every sound. When I finally did sleep, my dreams were filled with dark water and something pale moving beneath its surface. I woke to gray dawn light filtering through the cabin's broken roof and the smell of coffee brewing on a camp stove Jake had set up outside on the porch. My sleeping bag was soaked with condensation, and everything in the cabin felt damp and cold. "Morning, sunshine," Jake called as I stumbled outside. He looked rested and energetic, completely different from his usual sluggish morning routine. "Beautiful day for hunting." I looked around at the gray, misty swamp and wondered what he was seeing that I wasn't. The air was thick with fog, reducing visibility to maybe 20 yards in any direction. Water dripped constantly from the Spanish moss above us, creating a steady patter that sounded almost like rain. "We going after deer today?" I asked, accepting a cup of black coffee that tasted like it had been made with swamp water. Boudreaux mentioned there might be wild hogs back in the deeper parts. Said they've been tearing up the vegetation around the old logging camps. Jake shouldered his rifle and the massive hunting knife I'd noticed the night before. "Figured we'd head east, maybe 3 or 4 miles, see what we can find." The idea of tracking dangerous animals in limited visibility didn't appeal to me, but Jake was already moving, wading into the waist-deep water surrounding the cabin. I had no choice but to follow. We moved slowly through the swamp, Jake consulting his hand-drawn map every few hundred yards. The fog seemed to muffle sound and distort distance, making everything feel dreamlike and unreal. Several times I was certain I heard voices calling from somewhere in the mist, but when I stopped to listen, there was nothing. "Map says there should be a dry ridge up ahead," Jake announced around 10 o'clock. "Good place to glass for game." But when we reached the coordinates he'd indicated, there was no ridge, just more swamp, the water now deep enough that we were swimming more than walking. Jake frowned at his map, turning it this way and that. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "According to this, we should be on solid ground." "Maybe the map's old," I suggested. "Swamps change over time. Flooding, erosion." Jake shook his head stubbornly. "Boudreaux drew this just last month. He was out here, saw the ridge himself. But there was clearly no ridge." I was starting to wonder if Boudreaux had been pulling Jake's leg, sending him on some kind of wild goose chase as payback for some old grudge. The two of them had never gotten along particularly well. "Let's head back toward the cabin," I said. "Regroup, maybe try a different direction this afternoon." Jake looked like he wanted to argue, but the water was getting deeper and the current stronger. We were already having to swim in places, holding our rifles above our heads to keep them dry. Reluctantly, he agreed. That's when we heard the scream. It came from somewhere behind us, back in the direction of the cabin. A human scream, high-pitched and filled with terror, echoing across the water and bouncing off the trees. It lasted for maybe 3 seconds before cutting off abruptly. "What the hell?" Jake started. The scream came again, closer this time. Definitely human, and definitely in distress. "Someone's in trouble," I said, already turning back toward the sound, but Jake grabbed my arm. "Wait. Listen." We floated there in the dark water, straining our ears. The swamp had gone completely silent. No frogs, no insects, no bird calls. Even the constant dripping from the moss above had stopped. The silence was so complete it made my ears ring. Then, from directly ahead of us, came a voice. A man's voice, calm and conversational, as if he were standing right next to us in the fog. "Help me. Please, I'm lost." The voice was maybe 30 yards away, but the fog was too thick to see anything. "Hello?" I called back. "Where are you?" "Here," the voice replied immediately. "Right here. Can't you see me?" Jake was shaking his head frantically, his face pale. He leaned close to my ear and whispered, "That's not right. Sound doesn't carry like that in fog." "I'm hurt," the voice continued, still calm despite claiming injury. "Been walking all night. My leg. I think it's broken." Standard protocol said we should help, but something about the voice bothered me. It was too clear, too close, and there was something wrong with the cadence. The pauses between words were too long, like someone reading from a script. "Can you see our light?" I called, pulling out my flashlight and switching it on. The beam barely penetrated 5 feet into the fog. "Yes," the voice said immediately. "I can see you perfectly." That decided it. If he could see us perfectly in this fog, he wasn't human. Jake was already backing away, moving as quietly as possible through the water. I followed, keeping my rifle ready and my flashlight pointed toward where the voice had come from. "Don't leave me," the voice called after us. But now there was something else in the tone. Something hungry. "I've been waiting so long." We moved as fast as we dared through the water, trying to put distance between us and whatever was speaking in the fog. The voice followed us for a while, always maintaining the same distance, always claiming to be lost and hurt. But eventually, it faded away, replaced by the normal sounds of the swamp. It took us 3 hours to find our way back to the cabin, and by then, both of us were exhausted and spooked. We didn't talk about what we'd heard, but I could see in Jake's eyes that he was thinking the same thing I was. We weren't alone out here. That afternoon, we stayed close to the cabin, setting up on the porch to watch for any game that might wander within range. But the swamp seemed empty of life. No birds, no squirrels, no sign of the deer or hogs we'd come to hunt. Even the insects seemed subdued, their usual chorus reduced to a barely audible whisper. As evening approached, Jake announced he was going to gather firewood from a cluster of dead trees he'd spotted about a quarter mile from the cabin. "I'll come with you," I offered, not liking the idea of splitting up. "Nah, I got it. You stay here, keep watch. Back in 20 minutes. He waded off into the swamp, carrying a small hatchet and a canvas sack for the wood. I watched until the fog and shadows swallowed him, then settled down on the porch to wait. 20 minutes came and went, then 30, then an hour. I called his name, but my voice seemed to die in the thick air, absorbed by the moss and mist. I fired a shot into the air, a signal we'd agreed on if we got separated, but heard no answering shot. As the sun set and darkness began to fall, I faced a choice: stay at the cabin and hope Jake found his way back, or go looking for him in the dark swamp. Neither option appealed to me, but I couldn't just abandon my best friend. I gathered my gear, loaded my rifle, and set off in the direction Jake had gone. The darkness under the canopy was absolute. My flashlight beam seemed pathetically weak against it, creating a small bubble of yellow light that only emphasized how vast and black everything else was. Every step was treacherous, the soft ground threatening to swallow my boots or dump me into unexpected deep water. I found the dead trees Jake had mentioned, a cluster of lightning-struck cypresses, their bare branches reaching toward the canopy like skeletal fingers. The hatchet was there, stuck in one of the trunks, but there was no sign of Jake himself. "Jake!" I called, louder this time. "Jake, where are you?" My voice echoed strangely in the darkness, coming back to me distorted and changed. But there was no answer. I searched the area as thoroughly as I dared, following what looked like drag marks in the soft earth. They led toward a section of particularly deep, dark water, then disappeared entirely. My flashlight beam couldn't penetrate the black surface. It could have been 2 feet deep or 20. That's when I heard the whistling. It came from somewhere behind me, a simple tune I recognized but couldn't place. Something from childhood, maybe a nursery rhyme or a song from school. The melody was clear and precise, definitely human, but there was something wrong with the timing. The notes hung in the air too long, overlapping in ways that should have been impossible. I turned toward the sound, raising my rifle. "Jake, is that you?" The whistling stopped immediately. "Jake, if that's you, answer me, damn it!" Silence. Then, from a completely different direction, came Jake's voice. Marcus, I'm over here." I spun toward the new sound, my heart racing. "Where? I can't see you." "Here, by the big cypress. I'm stuck." I moved toward the voice, pushing through thick vegetation that seemed to grab at my clothes and equipment. The beam of my flashlight danced wildly as I fought through the undergrowth. "Keep talking," I called. "I'm coming." "Hurry," Jake's voice replied. "Something's wrong. Something's very wrong." I finally broke through the last line of trees and found myself in a small clearing. In the center stood a massive cypress tree, its trunk easily 6 feet in diameter. And there, sitting with his back against the tree, was Jake. But something was wrong. He was sitting too still, too upright. His eyes reflected my flashlight beam like an animal's, and when he smiled at me, his teeth seemed too white, too sharp. "There you are," Jake said in his normal voice. "I was wondering when you'd find me." "Jesus, Jake, you scared the hell out of me. What happened? Why didn't you answer when I called?" "I've been calling," Jake said, still smiling that strange smile. "You must not have heard me." I moved closer, keeping my rifle ready. Something was definitely wrong. Jake's posture was all wrong. Too rigid, like a mannequin propped against the tree. And his eyes. There was something about his eyes. "Are you hurt?" I asked. "No," Jake said. "I'm perfect now. Everything is perfect." That's when I noticed the smell. Sweet and rotten, like flowers left too long in water. It seemed to be coming from Jake himself. "We should get back to the cabin," I said, backing away slowly. "It's dangerous out here in the dark." "Yes," Jake agreed, standing up in one smooth motion that was nothing like his usual awkward unfolding from a sitting position. "Very dangerous." He started walking toward me, and I noticed his gait was wrong too. Too smooth, too fluid, like he was floating just above the ground. "Stay back," I said, raising my rifle. Jake stopped, tilting his head to one side like a curious dog. "Why?" "You're not Jake." "Of course I'm Jake." The thing wearing Jake's face smiled wider, showing those 2 sharp teeth. "I'm your best friend. We've been hunting together since high school." "Prove it," I said. "Tell me something only Jake would know." "We caught our first base at Henderson Lake when we were 14, the Jake thing said immediately. "You threw up on the boat because you'd never cleaned a fish before." The facts were right, but the delivery was wrong. Jake would have laughed while telling that story, teased me about my weak stomach. This thing recited the information like reading from a manual. "What happened to Jake?" I demanded. "I am Jake," it repeated, but now there was something else in its voice, something cold and hungry. "And soon, you'll understand." The Jake thing started moving toward me again, and I noticed its feet weren't quite touching the ground. It glided through the undergrowth without disturbing a single leaf, its movements impossibly smooth and silent. I pulled the trigger. The rifle's report was deafening in the small clearing, and the Jake thing jerked backward as the bullet struck it center mass. But instead of falling, it looked down at the spreading dark stain on its shirt with mild curiosity. "That hurt," it said conversationally. Then it looked back up at me with those glowing eyes. My turn. The thing that looked like Jake rushed me with inhuman speed. I barely had time to work the bolt on my rifle before it was on me, knocking the weapon from my hands and driving me to the ground. Its fingers, which had been Jake's fingers just moments before, now ended in sharp black claws that tore through my jacket like paper. I rolled away, grabbing for the hunting knife I kept on my belt, but the Jake thing was faster. It caught my wrist in a grip that felt like a vice, and I heard bones creak under the pressure. "Don't fight it," the thing whispered in Jake's voice. "It doesn't hurt, not after the first moment." That's when I remembered the massive hunting knife Jake had been carrying. If this thing really was wearing Jake's body like a suit, then the knife should be somewhere nearby. I drove my knee into the Jake thing's solar plexus with all the force I could muster. It doubled over, apparently still vulnerable to some kinds of physical trauma, and I broke free, scrambling toward where I'd last seen Jake sitting against the tree. The knife was there, stuck point first in the soft earth. The blade was dark with something that wasn't rust, and it seemed to pull heat from my hand when I grasped the handle. The Jake thing recovered quickly, turning toward me with a snarl that no human throat could produce. When it opened its mouth, I saw rows of needle-sharp teeth, and its tongue was black and forked like a snake's. "You can't kill what's already dead," it hissed. "Maybe not," I said, raising the knife, "but I can damn sure try." The thing lunged at me again, and this time I was ready. I sidestepped and drove the blade deep into its side, feeling it slide between ribs and pierce something vital. The Jake thing shrieked, a sound like breaking glass mixed with a dying animal's cry, and staggered backward. Black blood poured from the wound, steaming where it hit the ground. The thing looked down at the knife protruding from its side with what looked like genuine surprise. "Interesting," it said in Jake's voice. "This blade has tasted sacred blood." It pulled the knife from its own side with a wet, sucking sound, apparently unconcerned by the mortal wound. But I noticed its movements were becoming less fluid, more jerky and unnatural. "Where is Jake?" I demanded. "What did you do with him?" "He's here," the thing said, tapping its chest with one clawed finger. "He's watching everything. He can feel what I feel, see what I see. He knows what I'm going to do to you." The creature moved toward me again, but now it was limping, favoring the side where I'd stabbed it. Whatever that knife was made of, it had done real damage. "He fought well," the Jake thing continued conversationally. "Better than most, but in the end, they all surrender. The hunger is too strong." I backed away, looking for another weapon, another advantage. My rifle was somewhere in the darkness, probably damaged from the fall. The only light came from my dropped flashlight, lying on its side and casting crazy shadows that made it impossible to judge distance or direction. "What are you?" I asked, trying to buy time while I searched for an escape route. "Old," the thing said. "Older than your little settlements, older than your roads and laws and churches. I was here when the Choctaw walked these paths, and I'll be here when your kind are just bones in the mud." It was definitely weaker now, its movements becoming more human and less fluid, but it was still dangerous, and those claws could open my throat in a heartbeat. "The locals have names for me," it continued. "Rougarou, Loup-garou, Swamp Devil, but names have no power here. Only hunger matters, only the feeding." The creature stumbled, catching itself against a tree trunk. The black blood was flowing freely now, pooling at its feet and releasing that sweet, rotten smell into the air. "Jake's still in there?" I asked. "Oh yes, he's screaming." That decided it. I couldn't save Jake, not from this, but I could end his suffering, and I could make sure this thing didn't get the chance to take anyone else. I charged the weakened creature, tackling it around the waist and driving us both to the ground. It slashed at me with those black claws, opening gashes across my back and shoulders, but I held on, driving us both toward the dark water at the edge of the clearing. "What are you doing?" the Jake thing snarled, its voice becoming less human with each word. "Something Jake would want me to do," I replied. We hit the water with a tremendous splash, and I felt the bottom drop away beneath us. The thing was stronger than me, even wounded, but it seemed to have trouble in the water. Its movements became panicked, almost desperate. "Cannot swim," it gasped, its voice breaking between Jake's familiar tones and something else entirely. "This body doesn't remember." I held it under, using my weight and position to keep its head below the surface. It fought viciously, claws raking across my arms and chest, but gradually its struggles became weaker. Just before it stopped moving entirely, the thing's eyes cleared for a moment, and I saw Jake looking back at me. Real Jake, terrified and grateful and sorry all at once. "Thank you," he whispered with his last breath. Then the light went out of those familiar eyes, and the body in my arms became just meat and bone, already beginning to decompose in the warm swamp water. I dragged myself back to shore, bleeding from a dozen wounds and shaking with exhaustion. My flashlight was still working, casting its weak beam across the now peaceful clearing. Of the supernatural creature that had worn Jake's face, there was no sign. The body had dissolved completely in the dark water, leaving only a faint iridescent sheen on the surface. I gathered my rifle, checked to make sure it was still functional, and began the long trek back to the cabin. Every shadow seemed to hide potential threats. Every sound made me jump, but nothing else emerged from the darkness to challenge me. The cabin looked exactly as we'd left it, our sleeping bags still laid out on the rotting floor, Jake's pack still sitting in the corner. I gathered my gear as quickly as possible, stuffing everything into my pack without regard for organization. All I wanted was to get out of this place and never come back. The truck started on the first try, and I'd never been so grateful to hear the sound of an internal combustion engine. I backed out of the clearing without looking back, navigating the narrow dirt road by memory and pure adrenaline. I didn't stop driving until I reached the interstate, and I didn't feel safe until I saw the lights of Baton Rouge rising from the darkness ahead. Even then, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see glowing eyes following me out of the swamp. The official story was that Jake had fallen into deep water while gathering firewood and drowned before I could reach him. The sheriff's department didn't question it too closely. Hunting accidents happened regularly in the Atchafalaya Basin, and they had neither the resources nor the inclination to mount a full search of the swamp. But I know the truth. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is right, I think I can still hear Jake's voice calling my name from somewhere deep in the darkness. Not the thing that wore his face, but Jake himself, warning me to stay away from places where old hungers still prowl. I never went back to the swamp. Hell, I barely hunt anymore at all. But I kept that knife, the one that had tasted sacred blood, as the creature put it. I had it blessed by 3 different priests and a Cajun traiteur I found in Lafayette, and I keep it sharp and ready. Because I know now that there are things in the dark spaces of the world that are older and hungrier than we can imagine, and sometimes they wear the faces of the people we love most, just to get close enough to feed. The Atchafalaya Basin is a beautiful place, full of life and history and culture, but it's also home to things that predate all of that. Things that remember when the world was wilder and crueler and more honest about what it takes to survive. I learned that lesson in October 2023, in a rotting cabin surrounded by dark water and older darkness. I learned it from something wearing my best friend's face, something that claimed to be as old as the swamp itself. And, God help me, I think it was telling the truth. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I am 28 years old. This happened in October 2023. The decision to go camping in the Kisatchie National Forest came during one of those mind-numbing Monday morning meetings where Jake kept clicking his pen and Marcus kept checking his phone every 30 seconds. We'd been grinding away at Meridian Consulting for 2 years, and the stress was showing on all of us. Lisa had dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't hide. Tom had developed this nervous tic of cracking his knuckles, and I'd caught myself staring at the wall for minutes at a time, thinking about absolutely nothing. "We need to get away from all this," I said, gesturing at the conference room that smelled like stale coffee and broken dreams. Somewhere with no Wi-Fi, no cell towers, no emails. Jake stopped clicking his pen. "You mean, like actual camping, with tents and bugs and nature?" "Exactly like that." I pulled up a map on my laptop. Kisatchie National Forest. It's only 3 hours south. There's this remote area near Longleaf Vista where my college boyfriend used to take me, completely off the grid. Marcus looked up from his phone. "I don't know, Sarah. Last time I went camping was Boy Scouts and I nearly died from a spider bite." "You got a mosquito bite and cried for your mom," Lisa said, smirking. "It was a very large mosquito." Tom cracked his knuckles again. I'm in. My therapist keeps telling me I need to disconnect from technology anyway. Says it's contributing to my anxiety. That's how 3 weeks later we found ourselves driving down Highway 165 in 2 cars. Mine loaded with Lisa and Jake, Tom's truck carrying Marcus and enough camping gear to survive the apocalypse. Tom had gone overboard with the preparations, bringing everything from a water purification system to a satellite GPS device that looked like it belonged on a space mission. This is insane, Jake muttered from the passenger seat, watching the civilization thin out as we passed through Alexandria and headed deeper into the pine forests. Why couldn't we just rent a cabin with indoor plumbing like normal people? Because normal people don't work 14-hour days and dream about spreadsheets, I replied, turning onto Forest Road 322. The asphalt gave way to gravel, then to dirt. Spanish moss draped from ancient cypress trees like tattered funeral shrouds, and the air through the open windows carried the rich scent of decomposing leaves and something else, something darker and earthier that made my skin prickle. Lisa pressed her face to the window. God, it's beautiful out here. Look at that mist rolling through the trees. It was beautiful, in a primordial way that made you remember humans were relatively new to this continent. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by the occasional glimpse of a bayou or the rusted remains of an old hunting stand. But there was something unsettling about the quiet. No bird songs, no insect buzz, just the crunch of gravel under our tires and the low rumble of Tom's truck behind us. My phone lost signal somewhere around mile marker 15. Jake's died completely. Not the battery, just died. The screen went black and wouldn't respond to anything. Weird, he said, shaking it. It was at 60%. That's what we wanted, remember? No distractions. The road narrowed to barely more than a trail, winding deeper into the forest until we reached the small clearing I remembered from college. It was exactly as I'd left it 8 years ago. A circle of hard-packed earth surrounded by towering pines, with a fire ring made of blackened stones in the center. A fallen log served as a bench, and someone had carved initials into a nearby tree. SMPDW, still visible but weathered by time. David Walsh. I hadn't thought about him in years. He'd brought me here for our 2-year anniversary, made love to me under the stars, and proposed marriage the next morning. I'd said yes, caught up in the romance of the moment. 3 months later, he was dead, wrapped his motorcycle around a tree on Highway 28. Sometimes I wondered if that was why I'd suggested this place, some masochistic need to revisit old pain. Tom's truck rumbled into the clearing behind us, and the silence that followed when he cut the engine was absolute. No wind, no rustling leaves, nothing. It was like the forest was holding its breath. "This is it?" Marcus asked, climbing out and looking around skeptically. "There's nothing here." "That's the point," I said, but I felt it too, the wrongness that sat in my stomach like a cold stone. Something about this place felt different than I remembered. Older? Hungrier? We spent the next 2 hours setting up camp. Tom had brought a massive 8-person tent that required engineering skills to assemble, while the rest of us made do with smaller dome tents arranged in a loose circle around the fire ring. Lisa kept muttering about having no cell service, even though that was supposed to be the whole point. Marcus discovered his brand new sleeping bag had a hole in it and spent 20 minutes trying to patch it with duct tape. "At least it's not raining," Jake said, looking up at the canopy. The sun was getting low, filtering through the trees in long golden shafts that would have been beautiful if they hadn't cast such strange shadows. Some of the shadows seemed to move independently of the wind, which was non-existent anyway. I gathered kindling while Tom worked on starting a fire. The wood was drier than it should have been for October in Louisiana, almost brittle. When I mentioned this, Tom just shrugged. "Global warming, probably. Everything's drying out." But as I bent to pick up another stick, I noticed something odd. The ground around the fire ring was scorched in a perfect circle, as if someone had poured gasoline and lit it. The grass inside the circle was dead, not brown or wilted, but completely gone, leaving only bare earth. Outside the circle, the vegetation was lush and green. "Hey, Tom, did you notice?" "Got it," he announced as flames leaped to life in the fire ring. But instead of the normal orange and yellow, the flames burned with an odd greenish tint. Tom frowned at it. "That's weird. Must be something in the wood." The fire cast dancing shadows that seemed too large for the flames that made them. As darkness settled over the forest, those shadows grew longer and more distorted, reaching toward our tents like grasping fingers. We ate dinner from cans and MREs, washing it down with beer that Tom had managed to keep cold in a high-tech cooler. The conversation was stilted, punctuated by long silences where we all stared into the fire. There was something hypnotic about those green flames, something that made your eyes want to follow the dancing light even when your brain told you to look away. "So," Lisa said finally, "what's everyone's scariest camping story?" "Please don't," Marcus said immediately. "I'm already freaked out enough by this place." "Come on, it'll be fun. Sarah, you first. You've been here before." I hadn't planned to tell them about David, but something about the firelight and the isolation loosened my tongue. I found myself describing that last trip, 8 years ago, when we'd heard something moving around our tent in the middle of the night. David had grabbed a flashlight and gone to investigate, leaving me huddled in my sleeping bag. He was gone for almost an hour. When he came back, he was different, I said, staring into the flames. Quiet. He wouldn't tell me what he'd seen out there. Just sat by the fire until dawn, not saying a word. And his eyes... I paused, remembering. His eyes kept reflecting the firelight, like an animal's. "Jesus, Sarah," Jake said. "Way to set the mood." She asked for scary stories. "What happened to him?" Lisa asked softly. "He died in a motorcycle accident 3 months later. But sometimes I wonder if whatever happened to him that night in the forest, if it followed him home." The silence that followed was broken by a sound from the tree line, a low, mournful wail that raised the hair on my arms. It was too deep for a coyote, too wild for a dog, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "What the hell was that?" Marcus whispered. Tom was already reaching for his flashlight. "Probably just a screech owl. They can sound really weird." But I knew it wasn't an owl. I'd heard that sound before, 8 years ago, the night David disappeared into the darkness, the night something came back wearing his face. The wail came again, closer this time, and I saw Lisa shiver despite the fire's warmth. The flames flickered and dimmed as if something had passed between them and the oxygen they needed to burn. "We should probably get some sleep," I said, though sleep was the last thing on my mind. "Big day of hiking tomorrow." One by one, we retreated to our tents. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the absolute silence of the forest. No insects, no nightbirds, no rustling of small animals in the undergrowth. Just the occasional pop and hiss of the dying fire and the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. I must have dozed off eventually because I woke to the sound of a zipper. My tent zipper, being opened from the outside. Slowly, quietly, as if someone was trying not to wake me. I held my breath and listened. Footsteps circled my tent. Not the heavy boots any of my friends would be wearing, but something softer. Barefoot, maybe. The steps paused at the back of my tent, and I felt pressure against the fabric, as if something was pressing its face against the wall just inches from my head. Through the thin nylon, I heard breathing. Deep, steady inhalations and exhalations that seemed to go on far too long. Human lungs shouldn't be able to hold that much air. The pressure moved away, and the footsteps continued around my tent before fading into the forest. I lay there for what felt like hours, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly, afraid to do anything that might bring whatever was out there back to my tent. When gray dawn light finally seeped through the trees, I unzipped my tent and crawled out. The fire was completely dead, not even coals remaining, and there was no sign that it had been banked for the night. The ashes were cold to the touch, as if the fire had been extinguished hours ago. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the footprints. They circled each tent in a perfect spiral, starting wide and gradually tightening until they reached the tent walls. But they weren't human footprints. They were longer and narrower, with claw marks where toes should be. And they were burned into the ground, as if whatever had made them left scorch marks with every step. "Morning, sunshine." Jake emerged from his tent, yawning. "Sleep well?" I wanted to point out the footprints, but when I looked again, they were gone. Just normal dirt and dead leaves, showing no signs of disturbance. "Fine," I managed. "You?" "Like a baby. Must be all this fresh air." The others emerged one by one, all claiming to have slept well. Only Marcus seemed a bit off, moving slowly and keeping his eyes downcast. When Lisa asked if he was feeling okay, he just nodded and mumbled something about needing coffee. We spent the morning exploring the forest, following what Tom insisted were deer trails but looked more like paths deliberately carved through the undergrowth. The trees grew denser as we moved away from camp, their branches intertwining overhead to block out most of the sunlight. The air grew cooler and heavier, thick with the smell of rotting vegetation and something else, something metallic and sharp that caught in the back of your throat. "Are we lost?" Lisa asked as we stopped at yet another fork in the trail. Tom consulted his GPS device, frowning. "According to this, we're about 2 miles northeast of camp. But that doesn't make sense. We've only been walking for 20 minutes. "Let me see that," Jake said, taking the device. The screen showed our location as a pulsing dot in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by blank space. No roads, no landmarks, no indication of how to get back to camp. "It must be malfunctioning," Tom said, but his voice betrayed his uncertainty. We continued walking, but the trails seemed to shift and change when we weren't looking directly at them. Paths that had led north suddenly curved east. Trees that should have been on our left appeared on our right. After an hour of walking, we found ourselves back at the same fork where we'd started. "This is impossible," Marcus said. He hadn't spoken much all morning, and his voice sounded strange, hoarser than usual, with an odd cadence that made the hair on my neck stand up. "We're probably just turned around," I said, though I didn't believe it. I'd spent enough time in forest to know how to navigate by the sun and landmarks, but here the sun seemed to move independently of time, and the landmarks kept changing when we weren't looking. We decided to head back to camp for lunch, but it took us 3 hours to find it, even though we'd only walked 2 miles out. When we finally stumbled into the clearing, we were all exhausted and on edge. "Something's wrong with this place," Lisa said as we collapsed around the cold fire ring. I mean, really wrong. Tom tried to restart the fire, but the flames kept guttering out no matter how much kindling he added. The wood that had burned so easily the night before now seemed resistant to flame, smoking and smoldering but never catching properly. "Maybe it got damp overnight," he muttered, though the air was bone dry. Marcus had wandered to the edge of the clearing and was standing with his back to us, perfectly still. When Jake called his name, he didn't respond. "Marcus?" I walked over and touched his shoulder. He turned around slowly, and for a moment, I didn't recognize him. His face was the same, but his expression was completely blank. His eyes, normally warm brown, looked almost black in the dim light. "I need to gather more wood," he said in that strange, hoarse voice, "for the fire." "We have plenty of wood," I said, but he was already walking toward the tree line. "I'll be back soon," he called over his shoulder, and then he was gone, swallowed by the shadows between the trees. We waited for him to return. An hour passed, then 2. Tom and Jake took turns calling his name, but the forest swallowed their voices without even an echo. As the afternoon wore on, Lisa began pacing nervously around the camp. "We should go look for him," she said for the 10th time. "And get lost ourselves?" Jake replied. "He's a grown man. He knows to follow his own trail back." But I was remembering David, how he'd disappeared into those same trees 8 years ago, how he'd come back changed. The sun was setting when Marcus finally emerged from the forest. He carried an armload of wood, perfectly straight branches that looked like they'd been cut with a saw rather than broken from trees. His clothes were clean, no dirt or leaves despite spending hours in the forest, and he was smiling, a wide, unnatural grin that never wavered. "Got wood," he said in that same hoarse voice, dropping the branches by the fire ring. "Lots of wood." The wood caught immediately when Tom lit it, burning with those same green flames from the night before. But now the flames seemed brighter, more active, casting shadows that moved independently of the fire. "Where were you?" Lisa demanded. "We were worried sick." Marcus turned that unsettling smile on her. "Just gathering wood, like I said." "For 4 hours." "Time moves differently here," he said, and his voice carried an odd resonance, as if someone else was speaking through him. "Sometimes fast, sometimes slow. Depends on what's watching." We ate dinner in uncomfortable silence. Marcus sat apart from the group, staring into the fire with that fixed smile. He didn't eat, didn't drink, just watched the flames dance with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "I think we should leave," I whispered to Jake when Marcus got up to relieve himself in the woods. "Something's wrong with him. He's probably just dehydrated or something. People act weird when they're dehydrated. Jake, look at him. Really look at him. That's not Marcus." But Jake wouldn't listen. None of them would listen. They made excuses: stress, altitude sickness, too much sun. Anything except admitting that something was fundamentally wrong with our friend. As night fell, the green flames grew brighter and taller, reaching toward the star-scattered sky like grasping fingers. The shadows they cast writhed and twisted, and I could swear I saw shapes moving within them. Tall, emaciated figures with 2 long limbs and eyes that reflected the firelight. Marcus hadn't returned from the woods. "Where is he?" Lisa asked, voicing what we were all thinking. I grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the tree line, but Tom caught my arm. "Don't," he said. "Remember what happened to your boyfriend." The words hit me like a physical blow. Tom knew about David's accident, but I'd never told him about that night in the forest. How could he know unless... A hand fell on my shoulder, and I spun around to find Marcus standing behind me. But something was wrong with his proportions. He seemed taller than before, his limbs longer, his fingers extended into what looked almost like claws. "Sorry," he said in that hoarse voice. "Had to take care of something." In the firelight, his eyes reflected the flames like mirrors. "Marcus," I said carefully, "what happened to you out there?" He tilted his head at an impossible angle, as if his neck had extra vertebrae. "Nothing happened to Marcus. Marcus is still out there gathering wood. I'm just borrowing his face for a while." Lisa screamed. It was a high, piercing sound that cut through the night air and seemed to make the very trees recoil. The thing wearing Marcus's face turned toward her, and its smile widened until it reached from ear to ear, showing far too many teeth. "Don't scream," it said in a voice that was definitely not Marcus. "You'll wake the others." "What others?" Jake whispered. The thing gestured toward the tree line, and I saw them. Dozens of pale figures standing just outside the circle of firelight. They were human-shaped, but wrong, with elongated limbs and faces that seemed to shift and blur when you looked directly at them. Some wore the remnants of clothing, others were naked and covered in what looked like ritual scars. All of them had the same reflecting eyes. "We've been waiting so long for visitors," the Marcus thing said. "So long since anyone came to our special place." "What do you want?" I managed to ask. "To trade, a life for a life, a soul for a soul. The old agreements must be honored." I thought about David, about how he'd changed after that night 8 years ago, about the motorcycle accident that had seemed so random at the time. Maybe it hadn't been an accident at all. Maybe he'd been trying to escape something that was already inside him. "Take me," I said before I could think better of it. "Leave them alone." The Marcus thing laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, but we need them all. The ritual requires 5 souls, and we've been so patient. So very patient. Tom stepped forward, his hands shaking. Marcus, if you're still in there. The thing's head snapped toward him with a wet, cracking sound. Marcus is gone, but don't worry, you'll join him soon. That's when Jake made his move. He grabbed a burning branch from the fire and swung it at the Marcus thing's head. The creature shrieked and staggered backward, its borrowed face peeling away like old wallpaper to reveal something underneath that my mind refused to process. "Run!" I screamed, and we scattered into the forest. I crashed through the undergrowth, branches tearing at my clothes and face. Behind me, I could hear the others screaming, and beneath their voices, something else, a howling that seemed to come from the earth itself. I don't know how long I ran. Time had no meaning in that place. The trees seemed to move around me, paths appearing and disappearing, leading me deeper into a forest that had no end. My flashlight died after 10 minutes, but somehow I could still see, as if the very air gave off a faint, sickly luminescence. When I finally stopped to catch my breath, I realized I was completely alone. No sounds of pursuit, no voices calling my name, nothing but the oppressive silence of the forest. I tried to retrace my steps, but every tree looked the same. Every shadow hid potential horrors. I found Lisa first. She was hanging from a cypress tree, suspended by what looked like spider silk but was too thick, too oily. Her eyes were gone, replaced by gaping holes that wept a dark substance that wasn't quite blood. She was still alive, still breathing, but when she turned her head toward me, I saw that her mouth had been sewn shut with the same oily thread. I wanted to help her, wanted to cut her down, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking long enough to grab my pocket knife, and part of me, the cowardly part that just wanted to survive, whispered that it was already too late for her. I kept moving, guided by some instinct that told me to head toward water. Every swamp had a way out, every bayou led somewhere, but the forest seemed to stretch on forever, a maze of trees and shadows that defied navigation. I found Jake next, or what was left of him. He was sitting against a tree trunk, apparently unharmed, but when I called his name, he didn't respond. When I got closer, I saw why. His skull had been cracked open like an egg, and something had scooped out everything inside. But his body still moved, still breathed, a puppet controlled by something that wasn't Jake. "Sarah," it said in Jake's voice, but the mouth didn't move properly. "Help me. Something's wrong with my head." I backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs. The Jake thing tried to stand but couldn't quite manage it, its movements jerky and unnatural. Dark fluid leaked from the crack in its skull, pooling in the dead leaves around its feet. "Don't leave me here," it pleaded, and for a moment it sounded so much like Jake that I almost believed it was him. "Please, Sarah, I'm so scared." But I could see the truth in its eyes, the same reflecting glow that had been in Marcus's eyes. Whatever was wearing Jake's body wasn't my friend. I ran again, deeper into the forest, away from the clearing and the fire and any hope of rescue. My only thought was to get as far away as possible from those things, those puppets that wore familiar faces but harbored alien minds. The trees began to thin, and I caught the scent of water, that distinctive smell of a Louisiana bayou, equal parts life and decay. I pushed through a stand of cattails and found myself on the bank of a slow-moving creek that reflected the starlight like black glass. Tom was standing in the water up to his waist, perfectly still. For a moment, hope flared in my chest. Maybe he'd escaped. Maybe we could get out of this nightmare together. But as I got closer, I saw the truth. His throat had been opened from ear to ear, and something wet and glistening was moving inside the wound. Not blood, something alive. When he turned toward me, I saw that his eyes were gone too, replaced by clusters of tiny, writhing things that might have been worms or might have been something worse. "The water's nice," he said in a voice like bubbling mud. "Cool and clean. You should join me." He took a step toward the bank, and I saw more of those worm things dropping from the wound in his throat, splashing into the dark water where they immediately began swimming toward me with purposeful intent. I turned and ran again, following the creek bank away from Tom and his new passengers. The water gurgled and chuckled beside me as if it found my terror amusing. That's when I heard Marcus calling my name. Not the thing that had been wearing his face, but Marcus himself. His real voice, terrified and desperate, coming from somewhere ahead of me in the darkness. "Sarah, help me! I'm trapped!" I knew it was probably another trick, another puppet show put on by the things in the forest. But what if it wasn't? What if the real Marcus was still alive somewhere, still fighting? I followed his voice to a massive oak tree whose trunk was so wide it would have taken 6 people holding hands to encircle it. Marcus was inside the tree, not hidden behind it, but actually inside the trunk, as if the bark had grown around him. His face protruded from the wood, his features distorted by the pressure but still recognizably him. "Thank God," he gasped when he saw me. "I thought I was going to die in here. They put me in here, Sarah. Those things, they put me inside the tree." "How do I get you out?" I asked, though I could already see the futility of it. The bark had grown over most of his body, leaving only his face and one arm exposed. "I don't know. I can't feel anything below my neck. But listen, I heard them talking. There's a way out of the forest, but you have to find the old hunting cabin. It's about a mile north of here, past the dead cypress grove. The owner used to hunt these things, had some kind of protection around the cabin. I'm not leaving you here. You have to. Look at me, Sarah. I'm part of the tree now, but you can still get out. You can warn people about this place." Tears were running down my face, but I nodded. Marcus was right. There was nothing I could do for him. But maybe I could escape. Maybe I could make sure no one else ever came to this cursed place. "Go," he whispered, "before they realize you're here." I kissed his forehead, the bark rough against my lips, and whispered that I was sorry. Then I turned north, toward the dead cypress grove and whatever slim hope of escape it might offer. The grove was easy to find, a circle of skeletal trees that looked like they'd been struck by lightning and left to rot. Their branches reached toward the sky like the arms of desperate souls pleading for salvation that would never come. And beyond them, barely visible in the starlight, was a small wooden structure that might once have been a hunting cabin. It was falling apart, the roof partially collapsed and the walls gray with age and weathering. But as I got closer, I could see symbols carved into the wood, protective wards that made my skin tingle when I looked at them directly. The door hung open on rusted hinges, and I could smell sage and something else, something that reminded me of churches and holy water. I stepped inside and immediately felt the difference. The oppressive weight that had been pressing down on me since we'd arrived in the forest lifted slightly, as if the cabin existed in a pocket of normalcy surrounded by nightmare. There was a cot against one wall, a small table with the remains of someone's last meal still on it, and shelves lined with books and jars filled with unidentifiable substances. But what caught my attention was the wall covered in photographs and newspaper clippings. They told a story I was only beginning to understand. Photos of missing campers dating back decades, newspaper articles about unexplained disappearances in the Kisatchie National Forest, and handwritten notes detailing encounters with what the writer called the skin thieves. One note, written in a shaky hand, described them perfectly. They take human form but keep the memories and mannerisms wrong. They blink too little, smile too long, and their eyes reflect light like an animal's. They can only maintain the disguise for a few days before the host body begins to decay. At the bottom of the wall was a map of the forest, with red X's marking locations where people had disappeared. Our campsite was marked with a skull and crossbones and a note, "Feeding ground. Do not approach during the new moon." I checked my phone. The screen was cracked, but it still showed the date. October 23rd, new moon. A leather journal lay open on the table, its pages filled with the same shaky handwriting. The last entry was dated 3 years ago. They're getting stronger, more organized. The old protections aren't holding as well as they used to. I've managed to barricade myself in the cabin, but I can hear them circling outside, wearing the faces of people I used to know. My wife, my son, my best friend from college, all of them calling to me, begging me to open the door. But I know the truth. I saw what they did to the real versions, saw the empty husks they left behind. The things outside may look human, but they're something much older, much hungrier. They've been in these woods since before the first Europeans arrived, feeding on travelers and taking their shapes. The Choctaw knew about them, called them the Nalusafalaya, the long black being, said they would steal your soul and wear your body like a coat. The tribe avoided this part of the forest for generations, but white settlers didn't listen to Indian warnings. I'm the last one who knows the truth, and I don't think I'm going to make it out of here. If someone finds this journal, remember, don't trust anyone who comes back from the deep woods changed. Don't believe their stories, and whatever you do, don't let them take you back to their feeding ground. The journal entry ended there, but I could guess what had happened to the writer. He'd probably opened the door eventually, overcome by loneliness or fear, and let in something wearing a familiar face. I spent the rest of the night in the cabin, listening to voices calling from the darkness outside. Jake's voice, pleading for help. Lisa's voice crying that she was cold and scared. Tom's voice asking why I'd abandoned him. And Marcus's voice claiming he'd escaped from the tree and needed me to let him in. But I remembered the journal's warning, and I kept the door barred no matter how convincing they sounded. When dawn finally came, the voices stopped. I waited another hour, then cautiously opened the door. The forest was silent and empty. No sign of the creatures that had tormented me through the night. But I could smell death on the morning air, something sweet and rotten that made my stomach turn. I found a compass in the cabin supplies and used it to navigate east toward the road. It took me most of the day, following deer trails and creek beds, but eventually I heard the distant sound of traffic. I stumbled out of the tree line onto Highway 165, bloodied and exhausted but alive. A trucker picked me up and drove me to the sheriff's station in Alexandria. I told them my friends were missing, gave them the coordinates of our campsite, but I didn't tell them about the skin thieves or the feeding ground or the things that wore familiar faces. Who would believe such a story? The search and rescue team found our abandoned campsite the next day. Our cars were still there along with our camping gear and personal belongings. But they never found any trace of Jake, Lisa, Tom, or Marcus. The official report listed them as missing, presumed dead, and the case went cold after 6 months. I moved away from Louisiana after that. Changed my name, my job, my entire life. I thought distance might help me forget. Might let me sleep through the night without hearing those voices calling from the darkness. But some memories are too strong to fade, and some truths too terrible to ignore. That's why I'm writing this down, why I'm posting it online where anyone can read it, because I know they're still out there, in the deep woods of the Kisatchie National Forest, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting campers to stumble into their feeding ground. The skin thieves are patient. They've been waiting for centuries, and they can wait a few centuries more, but they're always hungry, always looking for new faces to wear and new souls to devour. So, if you're planning a camping trip to Louisiana, if you're looking for someplace remote and off the grid to get away from civilization, please remember my story. Remember that some places are empty for a reason, and some silences are too complete to be natural. And if you go anyway, if you ignore the warnings and venture into the deep woods, just remember one thing. If someone goes into the forest and comes back changed, if they blink too little and smile too long and their eyes reflect light in the darkness, that's not your friend anymore. That's something else wearing their face. Don't let it fool you the way I almost let it fool me. Don't open the door when it comes calling in the night. Just run and don't look back. The forest remembers every soul it's taken, and it's always hungry for more. My name is Marcus Chen, and I am 28 years old. This happened in October 2023. The smell hit me first. That thick, putrid scent of stagnant water mixed with rotting vegetation that clings to your nostrils like a warning. I should have listened to it. Should have turned around the moment we pulled into the boat launch at Henderson Swamp, part of the massive Atchafalaya Basin. But hindsight is a luxury I no longer possess, not after what happened in those cursed waters. Our supervisor, Janet Morrison, had thought a weekend camping trip would be perfect for team building. The 5 of us from Meridian Insurance's claims department barely tolerated each other during office hours, so the idea of spending 3 days together in Louisiana's largest swamp seemed like corporate-mandated torture. But Janet was persistent, and the company was paying, so here we were. Myself, Janet, David Rodriguez from accounting, Sarah Kim from customer service, and Tom Brennan, our newest hire who'd transferred from the Atlanta office just 2 months prior. The plan was simple enough. We'd take motorboats from Henderson to a small island about 15 miles into the basin where the company had reserved a rustic camping experience. No cell service, no distractions, just nature and forced camaraderie. What could go wrong? Everything, as it turned out. The October heat was still brutal, even at 8 in the morning. Sweat beaded on my forehead as I helped load our supplies into the 2 rented aluminum boats. The air hung thick and oppressive, filled with the constant buzz of insects and the distant calls of unseen birds. Cypress trees draped in Spanish moss rose from the dark water like ancient sentinels, their gnarled roots creating an underwater maze that extended far beyond what we could see. "Jesus, it's like stepping into a postcard from hell," David muttered, swatting at a cloud of gnats. He was a thin, nervous man in his early 30s, the type who jumped at his own shadow. His pale skin was already turning pink despite the layers of sunscreen he'd applied. "Don't be such a baby," Sarah laughed, though I noticed she stayed close to the dock, eyeing the murky water with obvious distrust. She was tougher than David, a former military medic who'd seen her share of unpleasant situations, but even she seemed unsettled by the swamp's oppressive atmosphere. Tom, on the other hand, appeared completely at ease. He moved with a fluid confidence that made the rest of us look like tourists, checking the boat engines and studying our waterproof map with the attention of someone who actually knew what they were doing. There was something almost unsettling about how comfortable he seemed, like he belonged here in a way the rest of us didn't. "The water's perfectly safe," Janet announced with forced enthusiasm, consulting her clipboard. "The rental company assured me these channels are well marked and regularly maintained." She was a woman who lived by schedules and protocols, desperately trying to maintain control in an environment that defied both. The boat ride started peacefully enough. The outboard motor's steady hum mixed with the gentle slap of water against the hull as we navigated the narrow channels. Towering cypress trees created a natural tunnel overhead, filtering the sunlight into an eerie green glow. Spanish moss hung like tattered curtains, occasionally brushing against our heads with ghostly fingers. For the first hour, we almost managed to enjoy ourselves. David had brought a waterproof speaker and played classic rock while Sarah took photos of the wildlife. Great blue herons, snowy egrets, and the occasional alligator sunning itself on a log. Even Janet seemed to relax, her death grip on the clipboard loosening as she actually began to appreciate the scenery. But then the strangeness began. It started with the GPS. Tom, who was navigating our lead boat, suddenly frowned at the device. "That's weird," he muttered, tapping the screen. "We should be heading northeast, but this is showing us going in circles." "Technology," Janet sighed from the second boat. "That's why I brought paper maps as backup." She held up a laminated chart, then her expression shifted to confusion. "Wait, this doesn't look right either." I leaned over to look at her map. The waterways we'd just traveled seemed to have rearranged themselves on the paper, channels appearing where none had been marked before, while familiar landmarks had simply vanished. It was as if the swamp itself was rewriting the rules of geography. "Must be a printing error," I said, though the words felt hollow. Maps didn't just change themselves. The second strange thing happened when we stopped for lunch on a small island roughly 2 hours into our journey. As we unpacked our supplies, Sarah's phone, which had been working fine that morning, suddenly displayed an impossible time. 3:47 p.m. According to our watches, it was barely past noon. Phone must have gotten damaged by the humidity, Tom suggested, but his voice carried an edge of uncertainty. One by one, we checked our devices. All of them showed different times, and none of them made sense. David laughed nervously. Maybe we've entered some kind of time warp, like that show with the island and the smoke monster. Nobody else laughed. The third incident was the most unsettling. As we prepared to leave the island, Janet did a head count, a nervous habit she developed over years of managing employees. "Where's Tom?" she asked. We looked around. Tom's backpack was still by the boats, his water bottle sitting half empty on a log, but Tom himself was nowhere to be seen. "Tom," Sarah called. "Tom, where are you?" "Maybe he went to take a leak," David suggested, but his voice cracked slightly. We searched the small island, calling his name. It took maybe 10 minutes to walk the entire perimeter. The place couldn't have been more than 100 yards across. Tom wasn't there. It was as if he'd simply vanished. Then, just as Janet was beginning to panic, Tom emerged from the tree line behind us. He moved slowly, deliberately, his usual confident stride replaced by something more mechanical. When he saw us staring, he smiled, a wide, unnatural expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Sorry," he said in a voice that sounded like Tom's but felt wrong somehow. "Got turned around in the trees." "Turned around?" I repeated. "Tom, this island is tiny. How could you get lost?" His smile never wavered. "Easy to lose your way out here. The swamp changes things." Sarah stepped closer to him, her medic instincts kicking in. "Are you feeling okay? You look pale." "I'm fine," Tom replied, but he blinked slowly, deliberately, like he was remembering how to do it. "We should keep moving. Daylight's burning." The rest of the boat ride passed in uncomfortable silence. Tom's behavior had shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. He steered with the same competence as before, but he no longer made small talk or pointed out interesting wildlife. When David tried to engage him in conversation about the Atlanta office, Tom just stared at him for a long moment before answering with vague, non-committal responses. Most disturbing were his eyes. Tom had always had warm, brown eyes that crinkled when he smiled. Now they seemed darker, deeper, like looking into still water at night. And he hardly blinked. I timed it once, nearly 2 full minutes between blinks, which is impossible for a normal person. We reached our campsite, a larger island called Alligator Point according to Janet's increasingly unreliable map, around what should have been late afternoon. The sun, however, seemed frozen in the same position it had occupied all day, creating a perpetual twilight that made it impossible to judge the time. The island was roughly circular, maybe 2 acres of solid ground ringed by cypress trees and accessible via a small wooden dock that looked far older than it should have been. A fire pit made of blackened stones sat in the center of a small clearing, surrounded by level spots where we could pitch our tents. As we unloaded our gear, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Carved into several of the cypress trees were symbols I didn't recognize. Crude spirals and angular marks that looked both ancient and fresh. When I pointed them out to Sarah, she went very still. "Those aren't random scratches," she said quietly. "Someone carved those deliberately. Recently. Probably just other campers marking their territory," Janet said, but her voice lacked conviction. Tom, who had been setting up his tent with mechanical precision, looked up at the mention of the symbols. His unnatural smile returned. "Old marks," he said simply. "This place has history." "What kind of history?" David asked. Tom's head tilted slightly like he was listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. "The kind that doesn't stay buried. We set up camp as the unchanging sun continued its impossible hover above the tree line. Janet assigned tasks with her usual efficiency. David and I would gather firewood, Sarah would prepare dinner, and Tom would secure the boats. But as David and I ventured into the trees beyond the clearing, the wrongness of our situation became impossible to ignore. The forest felt watching. I know how that sounds, but there's no other way to describe it. Every shadow seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at it, and the normal sounds of wildlife had been replaced by an oppressive silence broken only by the occasional splash of something large moving through the water. "This place gives me the creeps," David whispered as we collected fallen branches. "And what's wrong with Tom? He's acting like a robot." "Maybe he's just tired," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. The heat and humidity can mess with people. "Marcus," David grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in painfully. "Look at this." He was pointing at a massive cypress tree about 20 feet away. At first I thought he was showing me more of the carved symbols. Then I saw what had really caught his attention. Hanging from one of the lower branches was what looked like a small animal. A raccoon, maybe, or a large rat. But as we moved closer, the truth became clear. It was a doll, crude and handmade, fashioned from Spanish moss and cypress bark. Its face was a knot of wood carved into a grimacing expression, and tiny bones, bird bones, I hoped, were woven into its hair. "What the hell is that supposed to be?" David's voice had risen to a near whisper. Before I could answer, we heard Sarah scream. We ran back to the campsite, dropping our firewood as we crashed through the underbrush. Sarah was standing by the boats, pointing at something in the water. Janet stood beside her, her face white as paper. "What happened?" I demanded. The boats," Sarah stammered. "Look at the boats." I looked. Both aluminum boats were exactly where we'd left them, tied securely to the dock. But that wasn't what had made Sarah scream. The problem was what was inside them. Every piece of our gear, our food, our camping equipment, our emergency supplies, had been reduced to a black, rotting sludge that gave off a smell like death itself. Tents that had been brand new that morning now looked like they'd been buried in swamp muck for decades. Our canned food had somehow rusted through, spilling putrid contents across the boat bottoms. "How is this possible?" Janet asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "This stuff was fine an hour ago." Tom appeared beside us, moving with that same unsettling silence he'd developed since his disappearance. He looked at the ruined supplies with no apparent surprise or concern. "Things decay fast out here," he said in that flat, emotionless voice. "The swamp takes what it wants." "Takes what it wants?" I turned to face him. "Tom, what the hell does that mean?" His dark eyes fixed on mine, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw something else looking back at me. Something old and hungry, and definitely not human. "It means we're not going anywhere," he said with that horrible, empty smile. The reality of our situation began to sink in. No working supplies, unreliable navigation equipment, and apparently no way to call for help. We were stranded on an island in the middle of Louisiana's largest swamp with a man who was clearly not himself anymore. "We need to signal for help," Janet said, falling back on her management training. "Build a fire, make some kind of signal that rescue boats can see." "With what?" David asked. "All our gear is ruined." "We'll make do," Sarah said grimly. "I've been in worse situations." But I could see the fear in her eyes. Military training was one thing. This supernatural wrongness was something else entirely. As we scavenged for dry wood and tried to build a fire with Sarah's waterproof matches, the sun finally began to move, but in the wrong direction. Instead of setting in the west, it seemed to be sinking toward the north, painting the sky an unnatural shade of green. The fire refused to catch properly. Every time Sarah got the kindling lit, the flames would sputter and die, no matter how dry the wood appeared. When she finally managed to coax a small blaze to life, the flames burned a sickly purple color that gave off no warmth. "This isn't right," she muttered, trying again and again. "Fire doesn't behave like this." Tom watched our struggles with apparent amusement. He'd positioned himself slightly apart from the group, sitting motionless on a fallen log with his hands folded in his lap. Every few minutes he would cock his head like he was listening to something, then nod slightly as if responding to an unheard voice. "Tom," I called, "you want to help us out here?" "Fire won't work," he said without looking at me. "She doesn't like fire." "She?" David's voice cracked. "Who's she?" Tom's head turned toward him with mechanical precision. "The one who lives here. The one who's been waiting." Janet had heard enough. "Okay, that's it. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, Tom, but this isn't funny anymore. People could get hurt." Tom's laugh was like the sound of wind through dead leaves. "People will get hurt. That's what she wants." "What happened to you?" Sarah demanded, stepping closer to him. "When you disappeared on that island, what happened?" For the first time since his return, Tom's expression changed. The fake smile faded, replaced by something that might have been confusion or fear. For just a moment his eyes looked normal again, human and terrified. He started, then stopped. His face contorted as if he was fighting against something inside his own mind. She showed me things. Old things. Hungry things." "Who showed you?" I pressed. "Who is she?" But the moment was gone. Tom's eyes went dark again and that terrible smile returned. "You'll meet her soon enough. When the water rises." "The water rises?" Janet looked around at the swamp surrounding us. "What does that mean?" As if summoned by her words, we heard it. A sound like distant thunder, but coming from below rather than above. The ground beneath our feet began to vibrate slightly. "Earthquake," David suggested hopefully. Sarah shook her head. "Wrong kind of tremor. This is something else." The vibration grew stronger, and suddenly the water around our island began to churn. Not with wind or current, but as if something massive was moving beneath the surface. The level started to rise, lapping higher against the banks. "We need to get to higher ground," I said, though looking around the flat island, there wasn't much higher ground to be found. That's when we saw her. She rose from the water about 50 yards from shore, her form wavering like heat shimmer at first, then solidifying into something that hurt to look at directly. She was tall, impossibly tall, with skin like moss-covered bark and hair that writhed like Spanish moss in a wind that didn't exist. Her face was a mixture of human and something far older, with eyes like black water and a mouth full of cypress roots instead of teeth. When she spoke, her voice came from everywhere at once. The water, the trees, the very ground beneath our feet. "Welcome home, children." David made a sound like a wounded animal and stumbled backward. Janet's clipboard fell from nerveless fingers and hit the ground with a sharp crack. Sarah reached for the knife on her belt, though what good a 6-inch blade would do against something like that, I couldn't imagine. Tom, meanwhile, walked toward the water's edge as if drawn by invisible strings. "Yes," he said in that hollow voice, "I brought them, just like you asked." The realization hit me like a physical blow. "You've been working with her. That's why you knew how to navigate the swamp, why you weren't surprised by any of this." Tom turned back to us, and now his face showed no trace of the man we'd worked with for 2 months. "Tom Brennan never existed," he said. "I wore his face, learned his words, became him just long enough to bring you here. She's been so hungry, and you mortals taste so much better when you're afraid. The swamp hag, because that's clearly what she was, straight out of Louisiana folklore, laughed, a sound like breaking glass mixed with the screams of dying animals. Fear seasons the meat, she agreed, and you have given me so much fear already." The water continued to rise, now lapping at the edges of our campsite. Soon there would be nowhere to run. "What do you want?" Janet asked, her voice somehow remaining steady despite the terror written across her face. "What I have always wanted," the hag replied. "What I have taken from this swamp for 300 years. Life, breath, the spark that makes meat more than meat." "Why us?" David whimpered. Because you came willingly, the thing wearing Tom's face answered. Because you trusted. Because you brought yourselves to me like lambs to slaughter. I felt something snap inside my mind. Not breaking, but shifting into a clearer, sharper focus. Maybe it was the adrenaline, or maybe it was the simple human refusal to go down without a fight. Either way, I found myself thinking clearly for the first time since this nightmare began. "Sarah," I said quietly, not taking my eyes off the hag. "Your military training, did it include explosives?" "Some," she replied, catching on immediately. "Why?" "The boats, they run on gasoline, right? And we've got emergency flares in the safety kit." Sarah's eyes widened with understanding. "The fuel tanks are probably still intact, even if everything else is ruined." "Do it," I said. While Sarah began inching toward the boats, trying to stay out of Tom's line of sight, I kept talking to buy her time. "So, you've been doing this for 300 years?" I asked the hag. "Taking people from the swamp?" "Longer," she hissed. "I was old when the first Acadians came to these waters, old when the Spanish explorers thought they could claim this land. I have fed on the fear and flesh of countless mortals, and I will feed long after your civilization has crumbled to dust." "Fascinating," I said, genuinely meaning it despite our circumstances. "And you collect human servants like Tom here?" "When needed. Most mortals are too weak to survive the transformation, but occasionally I find one with potential." From the corner of my eye, I saw Sarah reach the first boat. She was working quickly but quietly, unscrewing something near the motor. "What kind of transformation?" David asked. To his credit, he was playing along with my stalling tactic, though his voice shook with every word. Tom's face twisted into something that might have been pride. "She showed me how to shed my human skin," he said. "How to become something greater, something eternal." "By wearing someone else's identity," Janet pointed out. "That's not becoming greater. That's just being a parasite." The temperature around us dropped noticeably, and the hag's form seemed to expand with rage. "You dare!" Her words were cut off by a brilliant flash and a roar that seemed to shake the entire swamp. Sarah had managed to rig one of the fuel tanks to explode, turning the first boat into a floating inferno. The blast sent Tom stumbling backward, his composure finally cracking. "Now!" I shouted. We ran. Not toward the water, that belonged to the hag now, but deeper into the island's interior, crashing through cypress roots and Spanish moss as the sounds of inhuman rage echoed behind us. "Where are we going?" David panted as we ran. "Away," Sarah replied grimly. "Just away." But on an island only 2 acres in size, away was a relative concept. We reached the far shore within minutes, only to find the water there was now boiling with unnatural life. Shapes moved beneath the surface, things with too many teeth and not enough human characteristics. "We're trapped," Janet said, stating the obvious. Behind us, we could hear them coming. The hag's voice rose in what might have been words or might have been the wind through dead trees, while Tom's footsteps approached with relentless mechanical precision. That's when I noticed the symbols again, the spirals and angular marks carved into the cypress trees. But from this angle, with the firelight from the burning boat casting wild shadows, they looked different. Not random at all, but deliberate, purposeful. "Sarah," I said urgently, "you said you recognized these markings." She looked where I was pointing, then went very still. Oh, no." "What?" "These aren't territorial markings. They're binding runes, protective wards." She traced one of the spirals with her finger. "Someone tried to contain something here." "The hag?" "Maybe. Or maybe," she looked around at the other trees, counting the symbols. "Maybe they were trying to keep her out." "Out of what?" Sarah's face went white. "Marcus, I don't think this is just an island. I think it's a grave." The ground beneath our feet chose that moment to prove her right. With a sound like tearing cloth amplified 100 times, The earth split open, revealing a cavity that descended far deeper than should have been possible. The smell that rose from the opening was beyond description. Centuries of death and decay mixed with something far worse. But it wasn't empty. Things moved in the darkness below, things that had been waiting far longer than the hag had been hunting. "Old friends," came the hag's voice from behind us. She stood at the edge of our small clearing, no longer bothering to hide her true nature. Up close, she was even more horrifying. 11 feet tall and covered in what looked like living bark, with fingers that ended in cypress thorns and a mouth that opened far wider than anatomy should allow. I've missed them so. Tom stood beside her, but the human facade was slipping. His skin had taken on a greenish tint, and his hair was beginning to resemble Spanish moss. Worst of all, his mouth had started to change, human teeth falling out to be replaced by cypress roots. "You see," the hag continued conversationally, "this island was once my prison. The indigenous people of this land, before the French, before the Spanish, before anyone your history books remember, they knew what I was. They bound me here, trapped me with their wards and their sacrifice." She gestured to the symbols carved into the trees. But wards weaken over time, especially when fed with the right kind of fear. It took me decades to break the first binding, another century to corrupt the second. The final ward, well, that required something special. "Us," Janet said dully. 5 souls, freely given. 5 lives offered up in terror and despair. The perfect key to unlock the perfect lock. As she spoke, the things in the pit below began to climb toward the surface. I caught glimpses of them in the firelight, humanoid shapes that moved wrong, former victims of the hag who had been transformed into something between living and dead. They climbed with the patient persistence of the damned, and there were dozens of them. However, the hag continued with what might have been amusement, the old wards contained more than just me. My former victims, my failed servants, all the souls I've claimed over the centuries. They were bound here as well. Quite the reunion we're about to have. The first of the pit dwellers reached the surface, a thing that might once have been human but now looked like a walking cypress stump, its limbs twisted into unnatural angles and its eyes replaced by knothole darkness. It fixed its attention on Tom with something that looked almost like hunger. "The old servants don't like the new ones," the hag explained helpfully. "Territorial, you understand." Tom backed away from the pit dweller, his newfound confidence finally cracking. "You didn't tell me about them. Did I forget to mention?" The hag's laugh was like breaking bones. "How careless of me." More creatures emerged from the pit. Men and women who had clearly been twisted by years or decades of the hag's influence, their humanity stripped away layer by layer until only hunger and malice remained. They moved in a pack, surrounding Tom with predatory intent. "Wait," Tom said, panic finally entering his voice. "I brought them to you. I did what you asked." "And you served your purpose beautifully," the hag agreed. "But I no longer need a servant. I need a meal." The pack fell on Tom with sudden, vicious efficiency. His screams were human at first, then became something else entirely as they tore at his transforming flesh with cypress thorn fingers and root-filled mouths. The sound was so horrible that David actually vomited, adding another layer of stench to our already nightmarish situation. "Now then," the hag said, turning her attention back to us as Tom's screams faded to wet gurgles. "Where were we?" Sarah still had her knife, though she was holding it more like a talisman than a weapon. "You said you needed 5 souls to break the binding," she said, "but if you kill us, you'll just have 4. The hag tilted her massive head. "Mathematics was never my strong suit." "Explain." "Tom wasn't one of us," Sarah continued, thinking fast. "He was your servant, not one of the 5 you needed, so killing him doesn't complete your ritual." For a moment, the hag actually looked uncertain. Around us, her servants had finished with Tom and were beginning to spread out, cutting off any possible escape routes. "Clever," the hag admitted, "but irrelevant. I can simply wait for another group of campers, another corporate team-building exercise. I have time." "But do you have patience?" I asked, finally understanding what Sarah was getting at. "These bindings have held you for centuries. How much longer before they start to strengthen again? How much longer before you're trapped here for good?" The hag's expression shifted to something that might have been worry. "The bindings are broken. I felt them snap when the first of you screamed." "Are you sure?" Janet asked, catching on to our desperate bluff. "Because those wards look pretty solid to me." We all looked at the symbols carved into the trees. In the flickering light from the burning boat, they did seem to be glowing faintly, though that might have been wishful thinking. "Besides," Sarah added, "if the bindings were really broken, why are your old servants still here? Shouldn't they be free to leave the island?" The creatures surrounding us had gone still, as if listening to something we couldn't hear. Their master was clearly agitated, her form wavering between solid and something more like swamp gas. "The ritual will work," she insisted, but her voice carried less certainty than before. 5 souls, freely given in fear. The old compact will be satisfied." "Freely given?" David laughed, a slightly hysterical edge to his voice. "Lady, nobody here gave you anything freely. We came here under false pretenses, led by your puppet. That's not a gift, that's theft." The hag's roar of frustration shook the entire island. Trees swayed without wind, and the water around us began to churn more violently. "Semantics!" she shrieked. "Word games and lawyer tricks." "Maybe," I said, "but according to you, these bindings were created by people who understood magic better than we do. Don't you think they would have been careful about the exact wording of their spell?" For a long moment, the only sounds were the crackling of the burning boat and the wet, horrible noises coming from what was left of Tom. The hag stood motionless, her ancient mind clearly working through the implications of what we'd suggested. Finally, she spoke in a voice like grinding stone. "Even if the binding holds, even if the ritual fails, you will still die here. You will become my servants, my playthings, my food. The only difference is whether I remain trapped or whether I am free to hunt the greater world." "Then we choose trapped," Sarah said firmly. "If we're going to die anyway, at least this way we keep you from hurting anyone else." The hag's laughter was like the sound of the world ending. "Noble. Stupid, but noble. Very well, then. If I cannot be free, I will content myself with making your deaths as slow and terrible as possible." Her servants began to close in, moving with the patient hunger of things that had been dead far too long. I found myself thinking about my family, wondering if they would ever know what happened to us. Wondering if anyone would ever find our bodies, or if we would simply disappear into Louisiana folklore like so many others before us. That's when the water exploded. Something massive erupted from the swamp around our island. Not one thing, but many things, all connected. Ancient cypress roots, thick as telephone poles and covered in centuries of growth, burst from the water and wrapped around the hag's servants. The creatures that had been advancing on us were suddenly pulled backward, dragged toward the pit they had climbed from. The hag herself seemed frozen, her terrible face locked in an expression of disbelief. "Impossible," she whispered. "The bindings are broken. I felt them break." "Did you?" asked a new voice. The speaker rose from the water near the burning boat, a figure that seemed to be made of Spanish moss and cypress bark, but arranged in an unmistakably human shape. Unlike the hag's grotesque parody of life, this being radiated a sense of ancient dignity and purpose. "Hello, sister," the newcomer said. "Did you miss me?" The hag's roar of rage was so intense that it actually knocked David off his feet. "Boudreaux, you're dead. I killed you myself 300 years ago." "You killed my body," the Spanish moss figure agreed, "but my spirit remained bound to this place, just as yours was, just as all spirits touched by the old magic remain bound until the debt is paid." "What debt?" the hag snarled. "The debt of innocent blood," Boudreaux replied. "Every life you've taken, every soul you've corrupted, every drop of fear you've harvested, it all must be balanced before you can be free. The cypress roots had dragged most of the hag's servants back into the pit, though their inhuman screams continued to echo from the depths. Only the hag herself remained on the surface, and even she seemed to be struggling against some invisible force. The bindings never broke, I realized. They just shifted. Boudreaux nodded to me with something that might have been approval. The boy understands. The compact was specific. 5 souls freely given in terror would break the first binding. But it said nothing about the other bindings, the deeper ones, the ones that hold the real power. Then why let her think she was winning? Sarah asked. Because she needed to believe her victory was at hand, Boudreaux explained. She needed to call forth all her servants, all her accumulated power, so that it could be properly contained when the moment came. The hag was sinking now, pulled down by the same roots that had claimed her servants. But she wasn't going quietly. "This isn't over," she screamed, her voice becoming more distant as she was dragged toward the pit. "I will find a way. I will escape. I will feast on the blood of 1,000 generations." "Perhaps," Boudreaux said calmly, "but not today, and not through these people." With a final, earth-shaking roar, the hag disappeared into the pit. The sound of breaking wood filled the air as the cypress roots withdrew, and then the opening sealed itself with a sound like a giant zipper closing. The sudden silence was almost deafening. "Is it over?" David asked in a small voice. "For now," Boudreaux replied. "The deeper bindings hold, and will continue to hold as long as this place is respected and left alone." "And us?" Janet asked. "What happens to us?" Boudreaux turned his attention to her, and I caught a glimpse of what might have been kindness in his moss-covered features. "You go home. You live your lives. You forget this place exists, and you never speak of what happened here." "Forget?" I said. "How are we supposed to forget something like this?" "Memory fades," Boudreaux said simply. "Pain fades. Fear fades. In time, this will seem like a dream. A shared nightmare brought on by stress and isolation and too much Louisiana heat." As he spoke, I could feel it happening, the sharp edges of terror becoming fuzzy, the impossible details becoming harder to hold on to. It was a mercy, I realized. No one should have to carry memories like these. "The boats?" Sarah asked, gesturing toward the water where our transportation had been burning. "You will find them intact in the morning," Boudreaux assured her, "along with your supplies, your navigation equipment, and a clear path home." "Why?" I asked. "Why help us at all?" Boudreaux was already fading, becoming more like a reflection on water than a solid presence. "Because some debts can only be paid through mercy," he said. "Because even in a place of such darkness, the light of human courage still shines." The last thing I remember clearly was the sound of normal swamp life returning. Frogs croaking, insects buzzing, birds calling to each other across the water. The sounds of a living ecosystem, not a supernatural prison. I woke up the next morning in my tent, dry and comfortable, with Sarah shaking my shoulder gently. "Marcus, you okay? You were talking in your sleep." I sat up, blinking in the normal Louisiana sunlight. Our campsite looked exactly as it should have. 5 tents arranged around a fire pit, our supplies neatly organized, both boats floating peacefully at the dock. "Bad dream," I mumbled, though the details were already slipping away like water through my fingers. "Must have been a doozy," David said from his tent. "You all were making noise half the night." "All of us?" Janet asked, emerging from her own tent with her hair disheveled and a confused expression. "Weird, shared nightmare," Tom said, and I felt a chill run down my spine until I looked at him. Normal Tom, human Tom, with warm brown eyes and a genuine smile. Something about getting lost in the swamp, probably just anxiety about being out here. We broke camp quickly and efficiently, all of us eager to get back to civilization, though none of us could quite articulate why. The boat ride home was uneventful. Our GPS worked perfectly, our maps made sense, and we reached the Henderson boat launch in exactly the time it should have taken. Over the following weeks and months, the details continued to fade. I remembered that something unsettling had happened during our camping trip, but the specifics became increasingly vague. Sometimes I would wake up with fragments of nightmare, dark water, twisted trees, something with too many teeth, but they never cohered into a complete story. Tom remained with our company for another year before transferring to a position in Texas. He was a good employee and a decent guy, though I never quite felt comfortable around him. There was something about his eyes sometimes, a depth that seemed older than it should have been. Sarah and I started dating 6 months after the camping trip. We never talked about Louisiana, but sometimes I would catch her staring at Spanish moss or cypress trees with an expression I couldn't quite read. She still had her military medical training, but she never went camping again. David developed a phobia of boats and water that he couldn't explain. Janet instituted a company policy against outdoor team-building exercises, citing liability concerns and employee comfort. And me? I moved away from Louisiana within the year, taking a job with a firm in Colorado where the trees are pine and aspen, where the water runs clear and cold, and where the only swamps are the ones that exist in half-remembered dreams. But sometimes, on humid summer nights when the air hangs thick and still, I remember the smell of stagnant water and rotting vegetation. I remember the feeling of being watched by something ancient and hungry, and I remember a voice like breaking glass, promising that some debts can never be fully paid. I keep those memories locked away in the deepest part of my mind, filed under nightmares and imagination. Because the alternative, that such places really exist, that such creatures really hunt in the dark spaces of the world, is too terrible to accept. Most days I succeed in forgetting. Most days. My name is Sarah Chen, and I am 28 years old. This happened in October 2023. I should have listened to the locals in Slidell when they warned me about Honey Island Swamp after dark. But grief makes you reckless, and I needed the isolation that only Louisiana's most remote wilderness could provide. My therapist, Dr. Elizabeth Moreau, had suggested reconnecting with nature after Michael's death 6 months earlier, though I doubt she had in mind what I was planning, a solo week-long camping expedition deep into the Honey Island Swamp Wildlife Management Area, armed with nothing but my backpack, my deceased brother's German Shepherd mix, Rex, and a desperate need to feel something other than the crushing numbness that had become my constant companion since that terrible phone call in April. The ferry operator, a weathered Cajun man named Claude Boudreau, had given me a look that spoke volumes when I told him my destination. His calloused hands, scarred from decades of wrestling with fishing nets and boat engines, gripped the wheel of his small aluminum boat tighter as Spanish moss-draped cypress trees closed in around us like gnarled fingers reaching down from some primordial nightmare. The boat itself was ancient, probably from the 1970s, with peeling paint and a hull that had seen better decades. But it cut through the black water with surprising grace, navigating channels that seemed barely wide enough for a canoe. "You sure about dis, Cher?" Claude asked, his thick accent making the words sound like a prayer whispered in a cathedral of trees. The way he pronounced my name, Cher, reminded me painfully of Michael, who had lived in New Orleans for 3 years before his death and had picked up the local inflections. "Dat swamp, she got a way of keeping what goes in, especially this time of year when the veil gets thin." Rex pressed against my leg, his usually alert ears flattened against his skull like he was trying to block out sounds only he could hear. I'd never seen him nervous before. He was Michael's dog, trained for search and rescue operations, fearless in the face of collapsed buildings, natural disasters, and human tragedy. He'd pulled 7 people from the rubble of a collapsed apartment building in Métairie just 2 months before Michael's death. But something about this place had him on edge, his dark eyes constantly scanning the water as if expecting something to emerge from its depths. "I'll be fine," I lied, scratching behind Rex's ears in the exact spot Michael used to favor. The gesture was automatic, learned from watching my brother calm the dog after particularly difficult rescues. We're just going to camp at the old hunting cabin near Black Bayou. 3 days, maybe 4. I need some time to think." Claude's weathered face, the color and texture of old leather, creased into even deeper lines. He'd been ferrying people into these waters for 47 years, he'd told me earlier, and had seen things that would make a reasonable person question the nature of reality itself. "Ain't nobody been to dat cabin in months. Not since spring, anyway. Last group dat went out there." He trailed off, spitting a stream of brown tobacco juice into the dark water. A ripple spread from where it landed, as if something beneath the surface had stirred. "Well, they came back different, real different." The boat's ancient Mercury outboard engine sputtered and coughed as we navigated deeper into the swamp, following waterways that twisted and branched like the circulatory system of some massive, sleeping beast. Ancient cypress trees, some over 1,000 years old, rose from the murky water like monuments to forgotten gods. Their massive trunks, some nearly 20 feet in diameter, disappeared into water so dark it might as well have been ink. The air hung thick with humidity and the smell of decay, sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in a tomb, mixed with the sulfurous stench of rotting vegetation and something else, something organic and wrong that made my sinuses burn. Spanish moss draped everything in ghostly shrouds, creating a canopy so thick that even the midday sun barely penetrated to the water's surface. In that twilight world, shadows moved in ways that defied explanation, and somewhere in the distance, an alligator's low bellow echoed across the water like the sound of something ancient and hungry awakening from a long sleep. "Different? How?" I pressed, though part of me didn't want to know. There was something in Claude's voice, a quality I'd heard before in the voices of first responders who'd seen too much, that suggested he was choosing his words carefully to avoid saying something that might send me fleeing back to solid ground. Claude was quiet for so long, I thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, he didn't take his eyes off the water ahead, navigating by instincts honed over decades in these treacherous channels. Day was missing pieces of themselves, not like... He gestured vaguely with one hand while keeping the other on the wheel. "Not like dat. Missing pieces of who dey was. Couldn't remember their own names for days. One of them, sweet little Marie Thibodeau. I known her since she was knee-high to a grasshopper. She come back speaking in tongues, but not French, not English, not Spanish neither. Something older, something that made your bones ache just to hear it." He paused, his throat working as if he was trying to swallow something bitter. And her eyes, Lord have mercy, her eyes was different. Like somebody else was looking out through dem, somebody that didn't much like what they saw. Rex whined low in his throat, a sound I'd never heard him make in the 2 years I'd known him. His dark eyes were fixed on something in the water ahead, but when I followed his gaze I saw nothing but the endless maze of cypress and moss. Still, the feeling of being watched was so strong it made my skin crawl, as if invisible eyes were cataloging our every movement, taking note of our weaknesses and fears. The sensation reminded me uncomfortably of the weeks following Michael's funeral, when I'd felt his presence everywhere, a shadow in my peripheral vision, the sound of his laugh in crowded restaurants, his voice calling my name in the space between sleeping and waking. Dr. Moreau had assured me this was normal, part of the grieving process. But normal or not, it had nearly driven me to madness. The antidepressants helped with the crushing weight of despair, but they couldn't touch the feeling that Michael was trying to tell me something, that his death had left some crucial conversation forever unfinished. The cabin sat on a small island of solid ground, maybe half an acre in total, surrounded by towering cypress trees whose massive root systems disappeared into black water that looked deep enough to hide a school bus. It was larger than I'd expected, a raised Acadian-style structure with a wide wraparound porch and shuttered windows painted a faded blue that had probably been cheerful once but now looked the color of old bruises. Someone had built it well, with thick cypress logs that had weathered decades of hurricanes and floods, and a corrugated metal roof that bore the scars of countless storms. But there was something wrong with it. something that made my skin crawl the moment Claude's boat touched the makeshift dock constructed of weathered planks and rusty nails. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on. The structure was sound, the porch swept clean, the windows intact. But the wrongness was there nonetheless, radiating from the building like heat from a fever, making the air around it feel thick and oppressive in a way that had nothing to do with Louisiana's legendary humidity. "I'll be back for you Friday morning," Claude said as I shouldered my pack, the weight of 5 days' worth of supplies settling across my shoulders like a familiar burden. Rex jumped onto the dock beside me, immediately moving to stand between me and the cabin, his hackles raised and his body language screaming danger in a way that made my heart rate spike. "You got that satellite phone I told you about?" I patted the pocket of my cargo pants, feeling the reassuring weight of the device. "Right here." "That thing don't work so good out here sometimes," Claude warned, his eyes never leaving the cabin. Even he seemed reluctant to look directly at it for more than a few seconds at a time. A swamp plays tricks on signals, makes them go places they ain't supposed to go. Sometimes you call for help and reach somebody been dead 20 years. He paused, studying my face with the intensity of someone trying to memorize features for a police report. "You change your mind. You light that emergency flare I gave you. I'll see it and come running, no matter what time, no matter what weather. You understand me, Cher?" I nodded, though part of me wondered if I would have the presence of mind to use the flare if something went genuinely wrong. The whole point of this trip was to be alone with my grief, to finally let myself feel the full weight of Michael's absence without the well-meaning interruptions of friends, family, and mental health professionals. I needed this solitude, even if it came wrapped in an atmosphere that made my teeth ache and my dog cower. As Claude's boat disappeared around a bend in the bayou, the silence settled over me like a burial shroud. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of normal wilderness. This was something heavier, more oppressive. The usual swamp sounds were there if I listened carefully. The distant splash of an alligator, the rustle of something moving through the underbrush, the hollow knock of cypress knees bumping against each other in the gentle current. But they seemed muted, as if the very air was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Rex pressed against my legs again, his dark eyes never leaving the cabin. Every muscle in his powerful body was tense, ready to bolt or fight depending on what emerged from the structure ahead. I'd seen him face down aggressive suspects and angry crowds without flinching, but whatever he sensed about this place had him more frightened than I'd ever seen him. The cabin's interior was spartanly furnished but surprisingly clean. Someone had been maintaining it, though Claude's warning suggested it hadn't been occupied in months. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth large enough to roast a small pig, flanked by built-in shelves lined with dozens of mason jars filled with unidentifiable preserved things floating in murky liquid. Some looked like plant matter, twisted roots and dried flowers, while others appeared more organic, like organs or body parts suspended in alcohol or formaldehyde. I tried not to look too closely at their contents. A rough-hewn table made from a single enormous slab of cypress sat in the center of the main room, scarred with what looked like decades of use. Knife marks scored its surface in patterns that might have been random or might have been deliberate. It was impossible to tell. A narrow ladder led to a sleeping loft that ran the width of the cabin, accessible through a square opening in the ceiling. Everything smelled of cedar and something else, something organic and earthy that I couldn't quite identify, but that reminded me unpleasantly of the morgue where I'd identified Michael's body. The scent seemed to cling to the back of my throat, making me want to cough or gag. I spent the rest of the afternoon methodically setting up camp, trying to ignore the way Rex refused to enter the cabin despite the approaching dusk and dropping temperature. He stationed himself on the porch, facing the swamp, his ears constantly swiveling toward sounds I couldn't hear. When I called him inside for dinner, freeze-dried beef stew that I heated over my portable camp stove, he whined and backed away from the door like it was electrified. "Come on, boy," I coaxed, patting my leg in the gesture Michael had taught me. "It's just a cabin. There's nothing here that can hurt us." But Rex wouldn't budge. His training had taught him to trust his instincts above all else, and right now those instincts were screaming at him to stay as far from the cabin's interior as possible. Finally, I gave up and fed him on the porch, noting how he barely touched his food, unusual for a dog who normally ate like he was starving. He kept lifting his head between bites, scanning the darkening swamp as if expecting something to emerge from its depths. As darkness began to fall with the sudden finality common to southern latitudes, the temperature dropped with surprising speed. In minutes, the comfortable October warmth gave way to a bone-deep chill that seemed to seep up from the swamp itself, carrying with it the smell of rotting vegetation and something else. Something chemical and wrong that made my eyes water. I built a fire in the massive fireplace, more for the comfort of light than warmth. The kindling caught easily, too easily, as if the wood were eager to burn. But as the flames grew higher, I noticed they burned with an odd blue-green tint that I told myself came from the salt content in the cypress wood. The fire provided plenty of light, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls that seemed to move independently of the flames that created them. As I sat cross-legged on the rough wooden floor, watching the fire dance and listening to Rex's nervous panting from the porch, I finally allowed myself to think about Michael without the protective numbness that had become my default state since his death. My older brother had been everything I wasn't, brave where I was cautious, selfless where I was practical, always charging toward danger while others ran away. He'd joined the fire department straight out of high school, despite our parents' pleas for him to go to college first. People need help now, he'd said, and that was Michael in a nutshell, always putting others' needs before his own, always believing he could make a difference in a world that seemed increasingly determined to prove him wrong. He'd died in a building collapse during a routine rescue operation. A gas leak had caused an explosion that brought down 3 floors of an aging apartment building in the lower 9th Ward. 7 people had been trapped in the rubble, and Michael had been part of the team that went in to get them out. He'd saved 4 before the secondary collapse that killed him and 2 other firefighters. The investigation later revealed that the building's owner had been cutting corners on maintenance for years, ignoring safety violations that any competent inspector should have caught. The official cause of death was crushing trauma and smoke inhalation. The unofficial cause was Michael's inability to leave people behind, even when common sense dictated retreat. He'd gone back for a 10-year-old girl named Amanda Guidry, and neither of them had come out alive. The fire popped and hissed, sending sparks up the chimney, and in the flames I could almost see his face. The same dark eyes we'd inherited from our Korean mother, the stubborn chin from our Irish father, the crooked smile he'd worn since a childhood accident had chipped his front tooth. Rex had been inconsolable for weeks after the funeral, searching every room in Michael's apartment as if expecting him to appear around the next corner, tail wagging and arms open for the reunion hug that would never come. A sound from outside made me freeze. It was barely audible over the fire's crackling, but it was definitely there, a rhythmic scraping, like fingernails or claws dragging across wood. The sound was coming from directly beneath the cabin, as if something was moving around under the raised foundation, exploring the underside of the floorboards with methodical patience. Rex's low growl confirmed I wasn't imagining it. The dog had gone rigid, every muscle in his body tense with anticipation, his dark eyes fixed on something beyond the circle of light cast by the cabin's windows. The scraping stopped. In the silence that followed, I heard something worse. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling the cabin with the patience of a predator that knew its prey had nowhere to run. The wooden boards of the porch creaked under what sounded like significant weight. Not human weight, but something heavier, something that moved with a fluid grace that made my stomach turn. My heart hammered against my ribs as I crept to the window and peered through the gap in the shutters. The moon was dark tonight, offering no illumination beyond the weak circle of light from the cabin's windows. But there, at the very edge of that light, I saw a shadow that didn't belong to any tree or post. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long for its body and joints that bent in ways that human anatomy didn't allow. As I watched, It moved with a fluid, serpentine grace that made my primitive brain scream warnings about apex predators and ancient fears. The shadow paused directly in my line of sight, and I had the horrible sensation that it was looking directly at me through the shutters, studying me with the cold calculation of something that viewed humans as prey. Rex erupted into frantic barking, his hackles raised to form a ridge along his spine, his usually controlled demeanor completely abandoned in favor of raw, protective fury. The shadow disappeared between one blink and the next, but the scraping sound resumed, now coming from directly overhead. Something was on the roof. I grabbed my LED flashlight with shaking hands and aimed it at the ceiling, following the sound as it moved from one end of the cabin to the other with methodical precision. The scraping was rhythmic, purposeful, as if something was systematically examining every inch of the roof, looking for weak spots or potential entry points. The sound of claws, for that's what they had to be, against metal was like fingernails on a chalkboard, setting my teeth on edge and making my skin crawl. The sound stopped directly above the loft where I'd planned to sleep. Rex's barking cut off abruptly, as if someone had flipped a switch. When I looked toward the porch, I saw him standing rigid as a statue, staring at something beyond the circle of light. His tail was tucked between his legs, and a low whine escaped his throat, the sound of a dog confronted with something that violated every natural law he understood. "It's okay, boy," I whispered, though my voice cracked on the words. "We're safe inside." But even as I spoke the words, I knew they weren't true. Safety was an illusion in this place, a comfortable lie that had no power against whatever was circling the cabin like a shark circling wounded prey. And as I watched, I noticed something that made my blood freeze in my veins. The mason jars on the shelves, the ones filled with unidentifiable preserved things, were glowing. A soft, sickly phosphorescence emanated from their contents, casting writhing shadows on the cabin walls that moved independently of the firelight. The glow pulsed rhythmically like a heartbeat, and with each pulse the shadows seemed to reach further into the room, stretching toward me with fingers of darkness that felt almost solid. The scraping resumed, moving toward the chimney with deliberate intent. Whatever was up there knew exactly what it was doing, and the thought filled me with a terror so profound it made my legs weak. I needed to get out of here. Every rational thought screamed at me to grab Rex, light the emergency flare, and wait for Claude in the boat. But as I moved toward my pack, the satellite phone fell from my pocket and clattered to the floor with a sound like breaking bones. The screen was cracked, spiderwebbed with fractures that hadn't been there an hour earlier. When I pressed the power button, nothing happened. The device was completely dead, as if something had drained its battery or scrambled its circuitry. I couldn't remember dropping it. Couldn't remember it making contact with anything hard enough to break it so thoroughly. But there it was, as useless as a rock. The fire in the fireplace flickered and began to change color, shifting from normal orange-red to that sickly blue-green I'd noticed earlier. The flames danced higher, reaching up the chimney as if trying to escape whatever was coming down from above, and in their light I saw something that made me stumble backward. There were symbols carved into the stones around the fireplace, deep, ancient-looking marks that seemed to writhe and shift in the dancing light, as if they were alive and aware of my presence. They hadn't been there earlier, I was certain of that, but now they covered every stone, spiraling patterns and angular designs that hurt to look at directly, as if my brain wasn't equipped to process their geometry. A sound from the loft made me look up. Something heavy had landed on the floor above, shaking dust from the ceiling beams and causing the entire cabin to creak and sway. Slow, measured footsteps began to pace back and forth across the loft, each one causing the ancient wood to groan in protest. Rex suddenly bolted from the porch, racing into the darkness beyond with a terrified yelp. I called after him, but he was gone, swallowed by the swamp as if he'd never existed. I was alone with whatever was upstairs, and the knowledge filled me with a despair so complete it made my legs give out. The footsteps stopped. In the silence that followed, I heard something far worse than any sound. A voice, soft and sweet, calling down from the loft with the gentle patience of someone who had all the time in the world. "Sarah? Sarah, honey, is that you?" It was Michael's voice, perfect in every detail, from the slight Louisiana accent he'd picked up during his years in New Orleans to the particular way he pronounced my name when he was trying to comfort me. Even the tone was right. The gentle, patient voice he'd used when I was upset, the voice that had talked me through panic attacks and breakups and the 1,000 small crises that had marked my path to adulthood. Every rational part of my mind screamed that this was impossible, that my brother was dead and buried, that grief and isolation and the strange atmosphere of this place were making me hallucinate. But the voice was so perfect, so exactly right. That part of me, the part that had never stopped hoping for one more conversation, one more chance to say goodbye, wanted desperately to believe. "I've been waiting for you, sis. Come up here." Tears streamed down my face as I stared at the ladder leading to the loft. It couldn't be him. It couldn't be. But what if it was? What if somehow, in this place where the normal rules didn't seem to apply, Michael had found a way back to me? What if the stories about the swamp keeping what went into it were more literal than I'd imagined? "I know you're scared," the voice continued, gentle and patient and so achingly familiar that it made my chest hurt. "But it's really me. I have so much to tell you about what comes after, about what it's like on the other side." My feet moved toward the ladder without my conscious decision. The rational part of my mind screamed warnings, cataloging all the reasons this couldn't be real. But the grief-stricken sister in me was stronger. I needed to see him, needed to hear him explain why he'd left me alone in a world that made no sense without him in it. The ladder rungs were slick with something that felt like moss but smelled like copper, like old blood mixed with swamp water. Each step upward took me further from the fire's light and deeper into a darkness that seemed to have substance, pressing against me like cold mud. The voice continued to coax me upward, describing how peaceful death was, how much he missed me, how we could be together again if I just trusted him. "Remember when we were kids," the voice said, and the memory it referenced was perfect, exactly right. "Remember when you had that nightmare about the monster under your bed, and I stayed up all night telling you stories until you fell asleep? I'm here to tell you stories again, Sarah, stories about what comes after the dark." I reached to the top of the ladder and pulled myself into the loft. Moonlight filtered through cracks in the roof, providing just enough illumination to make out the rough wooden floor and slanted ceiling. In the far corner, a figure sat with its back to me, silhouetted against the pale light. "Michael?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure turned, and my heart stopped. It was Michael's face, but wrong in ways that made my sanity recoil. His features were too sharp, his smile too wide, stretching literally from ear to ear in a way that human mouths weren't designed to accommodate. His eyes were black holes in his skull, reflecting no light, and when he opened his mouth to speak, I saw row upon row of needle-sharp teeth arranged in concentric circles like a lamprey's maw. "I've been waiting so long for you to join me, Sarah," it said in my brother's voice, though the words seemed to come from somewhere else, somewhere deeper and older than any human throat. "Down here in the dark, where all the lost things go, where all the guilty things end up." I scrambled backward, but my foot slipped on the ladder's top rung. I fell, crashing to the cabin floor with an impact that drove the air from my lungs and sent lightning bolts of pain through my left ankle. When I tried to stand, my leg gave out, and I collapsed again, my ankle already swelling inside my hiking boot. The thing that looked like Michael began to descend the ladder, moving with fluid, inhuman grace. Its limbs were too long, joints bending in directions that defied anatomy, and with each step its appearance shifted subtly. Sometimes it looked like Michael, sometimes like something else entirely, and sometimes like a horrible fusion of human and something ancient and hungry that had been waiting in the dark spaces between worlds for prey to stumble into its domain. "You can't run from me, sis," it said, tilting its head at an impossible angle that would have snapped a human neck. "I know every thought you've ever had, every fear, every regret. I know how much you blame yourself for my death, how you think you should have stopped me from going back for that little girl." The words hit like physical blows, each one finding its mark with surgical precision. I had blamed myself for not being there, for not insisting he find a safer job, for surviving when he didn't. The guilt had been eating me alive for months, and this thing somehow knew exactly how to twist the knife. "That's right," it crooned, circling me like a shark circling wounded prey. "You were always the selfish one, always thinking about yourself while I risked everything to help others. And where did it get me? Dead in a pile of rubble while you got to keep living, keep breathing, keep taking up space in a world that would be better off without you." I knew it wasn't really Michael, but the words found their mark anyway. Guilt and grief crashed over me in waves, threatening to pull me under completely. The thing approached slowly, savoring my anguish like fine wine, feeding on the pain that had been my constant companion since that terrible phone call 6 months ago. "But we can fix that now," it whispered, reaching out with fingers that ended in yellowed claws like broken bones. "You can join me. We can be together forever in the dark, quiet places where nothing ever hurts again, where heroes and cowards are all the same, where the guilt finally stops." Its touch was ice cold, burning against my skin like frostbite. Where its claws made contact with my arm, my flesh began to turn gray and lifeless, the color spreading outward like an infection. I could feel my life draining away, flowing into the creature like water through a sieve. But just as the darkness began to close in around my vision, a furious barking erupted from outside, followed by the sound of something large crashing through the underbrush with the force of a battering ram. Rex burst through the cabin door, his fur standing on end, eyes wild with protective fury. He launched himself at the creature without hesitation, 90 pounds of trained muscle and protective instinct finding purchase in what should have been my brother's throat. The thing shrieked, a sound like breaking glass mixed with a dying animal's scream and something else, something that made my bones ache and my teeth feel loose in my skull. It released me and spun to face Rex, its form shifting and writhing as if it couldn't decide what shape to take. For a moment it looked like Michael, then like a massive spider with too many legs, then like something with too many mouths and eyes and reaching appendages. Rex held on grimly as the creature tried to shake him off, his training taking over despite the otherworldly nature of his opponent. He'd been taught to hold aggressive subjects until help arrived, to never let go no matter what they did to him, and that instinct served us now. But I could see the creature's claws raking across his flanks, leaving bloody furrows in his thick coat, and I knew he couldn't hold on much longer. "Let him go!" I screamed, grabbing a piece of firewood from the hearth. The wood was burning, the flames now a brilliant white that hurt to look at directly, and when I swung it at the creature like a club, it recoiled as if I'd struck it with acid. The thing released Rex and backed away, its form becoming more stable as it focused on me. "You think fire can save you?" It hissed in a voice that was no longer Michael's, no longer even remotely human. "You think your pathetic human rituals have any power here? I am older than your species, older than your civilization. I was feeding on guilt and grief when your ancestors were still cowering in caves." But the flames seemed to disagree. They leaped from the wood to the creature's clothing, spreading with unnatural speed and burning with that same white-hot intensity. The thing screamed again, its form beginning to dissolve at the edges like smoke, revealing glimpses of something underneath that my mind refused to process. "I am eternal," it shrieked, backing toward the door as more of its form burned away. "I am the hunger that devours hope. I am the voice that calls from the dark water. You cannot destroy me." Maybe not, but I could hurt it. I grabbed another burning log and advanced, Rex limping alongside me despite his injuries, both of us united in our determination to drive this thing out of our space. The creature backed toward the door, its form becoming less solid with each step, more shadow than substance. "This isn't over," it snarled as it reached the threshold, its voice echoing from multiple directions at once. "I know your scent now. I know your pain. Wherever you go, whatever you do, I will find you again. The guilty always returned to me in the end." It dissolved into shadow and was gone, leaving behind only the smell of sulfur and rotting vegetation and something else. Something like burned flesh and broken promises. Rex collapsed beside me, his breathing shallow but steady. I gathered him in my arms, checking his wounds in the firelight. They were deep, but not fatal, and already the bleeding was slowing as his body's natural healing began to take over. We huddled together by the fire as the night stretched on, neither of us willing to sleep or even close our eyes for more than a few seconds at a time. Rex's ears remained pricked, constantly scanning for threats, while I fed log after log into the flames, keeping them burning white-hot. The symbols around the fireplace had vanished with the creature's departure, leaving only normal stone behind, but I could feel the presence still out there in the swamp, watching and waiting. As dawn broke over the swamp, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, I heard the distant sound of Claude's boat engine cutting through the morning silence. I'd never been so grateful for any sound in my life. Rex perked up at the noise, his tail giving a weak but determined wag. When Claude arrived at the dock, he took one look at us, me disheveled and exhausted, Rex torn and bloody, and nodded grimly, as if this was exactly what he'd expected to find. "She found you, didn't she?" he said without preamble, helping me lift Rex into the boat. "La sorcière du marais, the swamp witch." I climbed into the boat after Rex, my injured ankle throbbing with each movement. "Is that what it was?" Claude started the engine, eager to put distance between us and the cabin. As we pulled away from the dock, I saw movement in the windows of the structure we were leaving behind. Shadows that shouldn't have been there. Shapes that seemed to wave goodbye with too many arms. One of her faces, anyway. She takes the form of dose you've lost. Feeds on grief and guilt and all those dark emotions that make us human. Been hunting these waters for near on 200 years, maybe more. How do you kill something like that? "You don't," Claude said simply, navigating us through the maze of cypress trees with the ease of long practice. "Best you can do is hurt her enough that she leaves you alone for a while. Fire's good. She's got a healthy respect for Dad, but mostly you just gotta choose to stop feeding her." As we navigated through the cypress trees, leaving Honey Island Swamp behind, I thought about his words. The creature had fed on my guilt, grown stronger from my self-blame, and the grief that had been consuming me since Michael's death. Maybe fighting it had been less about the fire and more about refusing to give in to the darkness it represented, about choosing to live despite the pain instead of drowning in it. Rex rested his head on my lap and I scratched behind his ears, the same spot Michael used to favor. I would always miss my brother, always feel the pain of his loss like a wound that never quite healed. But I wouldn't let that pain consume me anymore. Wouldn't let it feed the hungry things that lurked in dark places waiting for broken souls to stumble into their domain. As we reached the dock in Slidell, Claude turned to me with a serious expression. "You gonna be all right, Cher?" I looked back toward the swamp, where Spanish moss danced in the morning breeze and ancient trees stood sentinel over secrets better left undisturbed. Somewhere in that maze of water and shadow, the creature that had worn my brother's face was healing, waiting for the next grieving soul to stumble into its domain. But it would have to wait a long time before it got another chance at me. "Yeah," I said, meaning it for the first time in months. "I think I will be." Rex lifted his head and gave a soft woof of agreement. Together, we turned our backs on Honey Island Swamp and walked toward the parking lot where my rental car waited. Behind us, the swamp whispered secrets to itself, but we were no longer listening. The drive back to New Orleans was quiet, both Rex and I lost in our own thoughts. I'd come to Louisiana seeking solitude to process my grief, but instead I'd found something far more valuable. The knowledge that some hungers should never be fed, some voices should never be answered, and some doors should never be opened. More importantly, I'd learned that healing wasn't about forgetting the pain or pretending it didn't exist. It was about refusing to let that pain define you, about choosing to move forward despite the weight of loss. As we crossed the Lake Pontchartrain Causeway, I rolled down the windows and let the salt-tinged air wash over us. Rex stuck his head out, ears flapping in the wind, and for the first time since Michael's death, I felt something other than numbness or despair. I felt hope. The creature had been right about one thing. It would find me again someday. Grief like mine didn't disappear overnight, and the hungry things that fed on human pain were patient beyond measure. But when that day came, I would be ready. I would remember the lesson learned in a fire-lit cabin surrounded by dark water. The only way to defeat the monsters that wear the faces of our dead is to stop feeding them our guilt. Michael was gone, but Rex and I were alive, and sometimes in a world full of hungry shadows and false hopes, being alive was enough. More than enough. It was everything. My name is Sarah Chen, and I am 28 years old. This happened in October 2023. The GPS had been acting strange for the last 20 miles, flickering between different routes like it couldn't make up its mind. Marcus gripped the steering wheel tighter as our rental SUV bounced along the increasingly rough road leading into Kisatchie National Forest. In the back seat, Jenny was scrolling through her phone with growing frustration. "Still no signal," she announced, holding her device up toward the window. "When's the last time you guys were completely off the grid?" "College," Tom replied from beside her, adjusting his thick-rimmed glasses. "Remember that spring break trip to Colorado? Spent 3 days thinking we were lost before we realized we'd been hiking in circles around the same mountain." I turned from the passenger seat to look at him. Tom Anderson had been the one to suggest this weekend getaway, claiming we all needed to reconnect with nature after spending too many months buried in our respective careers. As a software engineer, he spent most of his time indoors, pale and hunched over multiple monitors. The idea of him suddenly craving wilderness seemed out of character, but we'd all been feeling the weight of our routines. "That's different," Marcus said, his teacher's voice carrying that patient tone he used with difficult students. "We had cell towers in Colorado, out here in Louisiana." He gestured vaguely at the dense forest pressing in on both sides of the road. "This is proper wilderness. Bayou country. Different rules." The trees seemed to lean inward as we drove deeper into the forest, their branches creating a canopy so thick that afternoon sunlight barely penetrated. Spanish moss hung like tattered curtains, swaying in a breeze I couldn't feel. Everything looked older here, more primal. The air itself felt heavier, saturated with moisture and the earthy smell of decay. "There," Tom pointed ahead. "The turnoff should be just past that bent cypress." Marcus slowed the vehicle, squinting at a barely visible dirt path that branched off to the right. No signs marked it, no indication that it led anywhere humans were meant to go. The GPS screen had gone completely black, as if it had given up trying to locate us. "You sure about this?" Jenny asked, her nurse's instincts clearly picking up on something the rest of us were still processing. "This doesn't look like it leads to a campground." "It's not a campground," Tom said. "It's better. Completely undeveloped. I found it on some hiking forums. People call it Lost Hollow. There's a natural clearing about 2 miles in, right next to Saline Bayou. No other campers, no facilities, just pure wilderness." Marcus exchanged a glance with me. We'd assumed Tom had booked us a spot at one of the established campgrounds in Kisatchie. The idea of camping in some unmarked location found on internet forums felt reckless, but we'd already driven 3 hours from Baton Rouge. Turning back now would mean wasting our entire weekend. "Fine," Marcus said, turning onto the dirt path. "But if we get stuck out here, you're buying dinner for a month." The path was worse than the road we'd left behind. Roots and rocks jolted us constantly, and several times low-hanging branches scraped against the roof with sounds like fingernails on metal. The forest grew denser, blocking out more and more light until Marcus had to turn on the headlights despite it being mid-afternoon. I found myself holding my breath, though I couldn't say why. Something about the quality of the silence felt wrong. No birds singing, no insects buzzing, just the rumble of our engine and the crunch of leaves beneath our tires. Even the air smelled different here. Not just earthy, but almost sweet, like fruit left too long in the sun. "How much further?" Marcus asked after we'd been driving for what felt like hours but had probably been 20 minutes. Tom consulted his phone, though the screen showed no signal bars and no GPS location. "Should be just ahead. The forum posts mentioned a fallen log across the path that you have to drive around." As if summoned by his words, we rounded a bend and found exactly that, a massive cypress trunk lying across our route. Marcus parked beside it, and we all climbed out to assess the situation. The silence hit me immediately. After hours of engine noise, the absolute quiet felt oppressive, like stepping into a tomb. No wind rustled the leaves above us. No animals moved in the underbrush. Even our own footsteps seemed muffled, absorbed by the moss-covered ground. "We can carry our gear from here," Tom said, shouldering his backpack. "The clearings may be half a mile through those trees." He pointed toward what looked like a wall of vegetation. I couldn't see any path, any indication that humans had ever passed this way before. But Tom was already pushing through the brush, and after a moment's hesitation, the rest of us followed. The forest seemed to close around us like water. Branches caught at our clothes and scratched our skin. Thorns from unfamiliar vines left thin lines of blood on our arms. The ground beneath our feet felt spongy, uncertain, as if it might give way at any moment. "This is insane," Jenny muttered behind me, swatting at something I couldn't see. "Tom, are you sure you know where we're going?" He didn't answer, just kept pushing forward with a determination that seemed almost mechanical. His usual nervous energy had been replaced by something else, a focused intensity I'd never seen in him before. After what felt like an eternity of struggling through undergrowth, we emerged into a circular clearing perhaps 50 yards across. Massive cypress trees formed a natural wall around the perimeter, their trunks so wide that 3 people holding hands couldn't encircle them. In the center, someone had built a fire ring from blackened stones, though it looked old, unused for months or years. "See?" Tom dropped his pack near the fire ring. "Perfect, right?" It should have been perfect. The clearing was level and dry, large enough for our tents with plenty of room to spare. Through a gap in the trees, I could see water glinting, presumably the saline bayou Tom had mentioned. But something felt fundamentally wrong about the place, as if we were intruding somewhere we didn't belong. Marcus was examining the fire ring, running his fingers over the blackened stones. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. But look at this. He pointed to marks scratched into the largest stone. They looked almost like letters, but in no alphabet I recognized. Curved lines and angular slashes, carved deep enough to have lasted through countless seasons. "Probably just someone's initials," Tom said quickly, already starting to unpack his tent. "Come on, we're losing daylight. We should set up camp before it gets dark." He was right about the light. Though my watch showed it was only 4 in the afternoon, the canopy above us filtered out so much sun that everything had taken on the dim, greenish quality of twilight. And there was something about the approaching darkness that made my skin crawl, a primal fear I couldn't rationalize. We worked in relative silence, establishing our small civilization in the wilderness. 4 dome tents arranged around the fire ring. Our food hung properly in bear bags despite Tom's assurance that black bears rarely came this far into the swamp. Jenny, with her usual efficiency, had already laid out our first aid supplies and water purification tablets. "I'm going to gather some firewood," Tom announced once his tent was secured. "There should be plenty of dry deadfall around here." "I'll come with you," Marcus offered, but Tom waved him off. "No need. I want to scout around a bit anyway, maybe find that bayou. You guys finish setting up." Before any of us could argue, he'd disappeared back into the forest, moving with that same mechanical purpose he'd shown earlier. The sound of his footsteps faded quickly, absorbed by the oppressive silence. "Is it just me, or has Tom been acting weird today?" Jenny asked, sitting cross-legged beside her tent. Marcus nodded, still examining the carved symbols. "He's been different since he picked us up this morning. More focused. Usually he's all over the place, talking non-stop about whatever programming language he's learning or some new documentary he watched." I'd noticed it too, but hadn't wanted to say anything. Tom had always been the anxious one in our group, the overthinker who planned everything down to the smallest detail. Today, he'd been calm, almost eerily so, as if he'd taken some kind of medication to suppress his natural nervous energy. "Maybe he's just excited to be outdoors," I suggested, though I didn't believe it myself. We finished our camp setup as the shadows lengthened around us. By the time everything was secured, the forest had taken on that deep, twilight quality that made distances impossible to judge. Shapes that should have been trees seemed to move at the edge of vision. Sounds that might have been wind through leaves could just as easily have been whispers. "Where is he?" Jenny checked her watch. "It's been over an hour." Marcus cupped his hands around his mouth. "Tom, you okay out there?" No response. The forest seemed to swallow his voice immediately, as if the trees themselves were absorbing sound. "Should we go look for him?" I asked, though every instinct I possessed screamed against venturing into that darkness. "Let's give him a few more minutes," Marcus said. "He probably found something interesting and lost track of time. You know how he gets." But I could see the concern in his eyes. This wasn't like Tom. For all his faults, he was obsessively punctual, the type of person who showed up 15 minutes early to everything. Disappearing without explanation was completely out of character. The light continued to fade, and with it came sounds that hadn't been there before. Rustling in the underbrush that was too purposeful to be wind. A wet, sliding noise that might have been something large moving through the nearby bayou, and underneath it all, barely audible, what sounded almost like humming. A low, tuneless drone that seemed to come from the earth itself. "There," Jenny pointed toward the tree line. "I think I see him." A figure was emerging from the forest, moving slowly through the shadows between the trees. Even in the dim light, I could recognize Tom's silhouette, the slight stoop of his shoulders, the way he pushed his glasses up his nose every few steps. But something was wrong. He moved too slowly, too deliberately, like someone walking underwater. And he wasn't carrying any firewood, despite being gone for over an hour specifically to gather some. As he got closer, I could see his clothes were torn and muddy, covered in what looked like moss or algae. "Tom," Marcus called out, "where's the firewood? We were starting to worry." Tom stopped at the edge of the clearing just outside the circle of our tents. In the fading light, his face was a pale blur behind his glasses, but I could see his mouth, stretched in a smile that was too wide, too fixed. "Tom?" Jenny stood up, her voice carrying that professional concern she used with difficult patience. "Are you okay? You look—" "I'm fine," he said, and his voice was perfectly normal. Same tenor, same slight rasp from years of allergies. But something in the delivery felt wrong, like an actor reading lines he'd memorized but didn't understand. "Where's the firewood?" I asked. That too wide smile never wavered. "I couldn't find any. All wet. Everything's wet out there." That was obviously a lie. Even in a swamp there would be dry deadfall under the massive trees surrounding us. And Tom knew enough about camping to identify suitable firewood. He'd been the one to lecture us about fire safety during our trip planning. "Well, come sit down," Marcus said carefully. "We saved you some of the trail mix." Tom shook his head. "Not hungry. Going to sleep now." Without another word, he walked to his tent and crawled inside. We heard the distinctive sound of a sleeping bag being unzipped, then nothing. The three of us sat in stunned silence for several minutes. Finally, Jenny whispered, "That wasn't right." "Maybe he's sick," Marcus suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. "Sometimes when people are coming down with something, they act strange." "No," I said, wrapping my arms around myself. "The temperature seemed to have dropped 20 degrees in the past few minutes." "That wasn't sick. That was something else." We managed to gather enough firewood ourselves, though none of us wanted to venture far from the clearing. The forest felt hostile now, full of watching eyes and moving shadows. Every stick we broke, every footstep we took, seemed impossibly loud in the oppressive silence. The fire, when we finally got it lit, burned wrong. The flames were too blue, too cold-looking, and they cast strange shadows that seemed to move independently of their source. Smoke that should have risen straight up in the still air twisted and writhed like living things. "I don't like this place," Jenny said, poking at the fire with a stick. "There's something off about it, about all of it." Marcus nodded. "We should leave in the morning. First light. Make some excuse about Tom not feeling well." But even as he said it, we all knew we were trapped. Our car was nearly 2 miles away through dense forest, along a path we could barely navigate in daylight. And there was the matter of Tom himself. Whatever was wrong with him, we couldn't just abandon him. A sound from his tent made us all freeze. A wet, sliding noise, like something large and soft being dragged across the ground. Then silence. "Tom?" Marcus called softly. "Everything okay in there?" No response. We sat by the fire until well past midnight, none of us willing to be the first to retreat to our tents. The forest around us was alive with sounds now. Rustling, scraping, that low humming that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. Sometimes I could swear I heard voices in the distance, speaking in a language that hurt to listen to. Finally, exhaustion won out over fear. We banked the fire and retreated to our respective shelters, though I doubt any of us actually slept. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to every sound, jumping at every creak of the tent fabric. Sometime before dawn, I heard Tom's tent unzip. Footsteps circled our camp, slow and deliberate. They stopped outside each tent in turn, and I could hear breathing, deep, wet inhalations that went on far too long. When the footsteps paused outside my tent, I held my breath and tried to become invisible. The breathing continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then the footsteps moved on, circling the camp several more times before finally stopping. I must have dozed off eventually because I woke to Jenny screaming. Sunlight was filtering through the tent walls and I could hear Marcus shouting something I couldn't make out. I fumbled for the zipper, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the fabric. Outside, Jenny was standing in the center of our camp, her face white with shock. She was pointing at Tom's tent. The side wall was torn open, shredded from the inside by something with very large, very sharp claws. Dark stains covered the torn fabric. Not blood, but something that looked like mud mixed with rotting vegetation. Marcus was examining the damage, his face grim. Whatever did this was inside the tent when it happened. But Tom was nowhere to be seen. "Tom!" I called out, though my voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Tom, where are you?" No answer. The forest had returned to its oppressive silence, as if it were holding its breath. We searched the immediate area, calling his name, looking for any sign of where he might have gone. The ground around his tent was disturbed, churned up as if something had thrashed violently, but there were no clear tracks leading away. "We have to go for help," Jenny said, her nurse's training kicking in despite her obvious terror. Whatever happened here, Tom might be seriously injured. He could be lying unconscious somewhere, bleeding out. Marcus nodded. "Sarah, you and Jenny pack up the essential gear. I'll keep searching the perimeter. If we don't find him in the next hour, we head back to the car and get the Rangers." But even as we started breaking down our camp, I knew we wouldn't find Tom. Not the Tom we'd driven here with yesterday. Whatever had been in that tent last night, whatever had smiled at us from the tree line, it hadn't been our friend. The hike back to our car felt like a journey through hell. The forest that had seemed merely oppressive yesterday now felt actively malevolent. Branches seemed to reach for us deliberately. Roots appeared out of nowhere to trip us. The path itself seemed to shift and change, leading us in circles despite Marcus's careful navigation. My watch showed we'd been walking for 3 hours when we should have reached the car in 45 minutes. The sun, what little we could see of it through the canopy, hadn't moved from its position directly overhead. "This is impossible," Marcus panted, leaning against a tree that looked exactly like one we'd passed an hour earlier. "We should have been there by now." Jenny was checking her compass for the dozenth time. "According to this, we've been walking north this whole time, but I swear we've made at least 6 right turns. That's when we heard the voice. Sarah, Marcus, Jenny. It was coming from deeper in the forest, barely audible but unmistakably Tom's voice. Not the strange, flat delivery from last night, but his normal tone, filled with pain and fear. "Help me." "Oh, God," Jenny whispered. "He's hurt. He's calling for help." She started toward the voice, but Marcus grabbed her arm. "Wait, something's not right." "Please, I can't move. Something's wrong with my legs." The voice was definitely Tom's, but there was something about it that made my skin crawl. It was too perfect. Too much like the Tom we remembered. Like someone doing an impression of him. "Tom," Marcus called out. "Where are you? Keep talking so we can find you." "I'm here, by the big cypress. The one with the hollow trunk. Please hurry." We followed the voice deeper into the forest, despite every instinct screaming at us to run. The trees grew larger and more ancient as we walked, their trunks covered in a phosphorescent moss that seemed to glow with its own sickly light. "There," Jenny pointed ahead. "I see the tree he meant." A massive cypress rose before us, its trunk so wide it could have housed a small building. About 20 feet up, a hollow had formed where a large branch had broken away, creating a dark cavity in the living wood. "I don't see him," Marcus said, scanning the area around the tree's base. "Tom," I called. "Where are you?" "Up, here." The voice came from above us, from inside the hollow. We looked up, and I saw something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Tom was there, suspended in the hollow like a grotesque ornament. But he wasn't Tom anymore. His body was wrong, elongated and twisted, his limbs bent at impossible angles. His skin had taken on a grayish-green pallor, and what I had thought was moss was actually growing from his flesh, spreading across his features like a living mask. But worst of all were his eyes. They were still Tom's eyes, still human, still aware, and they were looking directly at us with an expression of absolute terror. "Help," he whispered, and this time the voice came from his actual mouth, which hung open in a silent scream. "Please, it's still inside me." That's when the thing wearing Tom's voice laughed. The sound came from behind us, exactly where Tom should have been standing if he were really lost and injured on the ground. We spun around to see something that might once have been human, but had been stretched and reshaped into something else entirely. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that bent in too many places and skin that seemed to flow like water. Its face was a constantly shifting mass of features, sometimes Tom's, sometimes a stranger's, sometimes not human at all. When it smiled, which it did constantly, its mouth revealed rows of teeth like broken glass. "Thank you," it said in Tom's voice, "for bringing me so far from the old places. I was getting hungry." The thing that had been in the tree, the real Tom, made a sound that was barely human. "Run!" We ran. Behind us, the creature laughed again, but the sound was already changing, becoming something else. Other voices, speaking words in that same language we'd heard carved into the fire ring stones. The language of things that lived in the spaces between spaces, that fed on isolation and fear. The forest around us came alive. Branches reached like grasping fingers. Roots erupted from the ground to trip us. The air itself seemed to thicken, making each breath a struggle. But we ran anyway, crashing through undergrowth, tearing our clothes on thorns, bleeding from dozens of small cuts. Behind us, the voices grew louder, multiplying, calling our names in tones of false concern and genuine hunger. "Sarah, why are you running from me?" "Marcus, I'm hurt. Please come back." "Jenny, I need your help. I'm a patient, remember?" The voices followed us through the endless maze of trees, always just behind, never quite catching up, but never falling back either. And slowly, I began to realize the horrible truth. We weren't running toward our car. We weren't running toward safety. We were being herded, driven like cattle toward some destination the creatures had chosen for us. The revelation came just as we stumbled into a familiar circular clearing. We were back where we'd started. Our tents still stood around the ancient fire ring, exactly as we'd left them hours earlier. But now they looked different. Wrong, somehow. The fabric was the right color, the setup identical, but something fundamental had changed. "No," Jenny sobbed. "No, this isn't possible. We were walking away from here. We were walking north." Marcus was staring at the fire ring, his face pale. "Look at the stones." The carved symbols had changed. Where before there had been a few scratched lines, now complex patterns covered every surface. Spirals and angular marks that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. And fresh carvings, still bleeding sap, that looked disturbingly like our names. "It's a trap," I whispered. "This whole place. It was always a trap." The voices were getting closer now, no longer bothering to maintain their human facades. They spoke in that alien language, harmonizing in tones that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. Through the trees, I could see shapes moving. Tall, wrong shapes that flowed rather than walked. "The tents," Marcus said suddenly. "Get into the tents." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the only shelter we had. We dove into the nearest one, mine as it happened, and huddled together in the small space. Outside, the voices grew louder, more numerous. "They're all around us," Jenny whispered. Through the thin tent walls we could see shadows moving. Too many shadows, cast by shapes that defied geometry. Some were impossibly tall, others seemed to flow along the ground like living liquid. All of them were converging on our fragile shelter. A sound like fingernails on metal began, slowly at first, then growing more urgent. They were testing the tent fabric, probing for weaknesses. The scratching moved around the perimeter, never stopping, never slowing. "What do they want?" Jenny asked. "Us," Marcus replied grimly. "Or what we can become." I thought of Tom, trapped in that hollow tree, still conscious while something else wore his form like a costume. Was that our fate? To be collected and displayed while creatures took our places in the world? The scratching stopped suddenly. For a moment, blessed silence returned to the forest. Then something spoke, very close to the tent wall, in a voice that was almost but not quite Tom's. "I know you're in there. I can smell your fear. It's delicious." The tent wall began to bulge inward as something large pressed against it. Through the fabric I could see the outline of a hand. If hand was the right word for something with too many fingers and joints that bent the wrong way. "Let me in," the voice continued, taking on a pleading tone. "I'm hurt. I need help. Please, you have to help me." The manipulation was perfect, designed to trigger every human instinct for compassion and aid. If we hadn't seen what had become of the real Tom, we might have fallen for it. Instead, Marcus grabbed our remaining camping knife and held it ready. "Stay back," he called through the fabric. "We know you're not Tom." Laughter erupted from multiple sources around our tent. Not just the Tom thing, but dozens of voices, all laughing at our pathetic attempt at defiance. "Oh, but I am Tom," the voice said. "I'm more Tom than Tom ever was. I remember his first kiss, his college graduation, the way his mother smelled like vanilla and worry. I remember the night he decided to bring you all here." My blood went cold. "What do you mean?" "He found us first, you see. 3 weeks ago when he came here alone to scout the location. We've been preparing him ever since, teaching him how to bring friends, how to bring food." Jenny made a sound like a wounded animal. "That's not possible. Tom would never—" "Tom had no choice. By the time he returned to your city, we were already growing inside him. Every suggestion he made, every plan he developed, every reassurance he offered, that was us, speaking through him. And you followed so willingly." The tent wall bulged again as more pressure was applied. This time I could hear the fabric beginning to tear. "But don't worry," the voice continued, taking on an almost gentle tone. "It doesn't hurt for long. The merging is actually quite pleasant once you stop fighting it. You'll still be you, in a way. We preserve the important memories, the useful emotions. You'll just be more than you were before." A claw punctured the tent wall near my head, letting in a shaft of that sickly phosphorescent light. More claws followed, systematically shredding our shelter. "The knife," I whispered to Marcus. "Give me the knife." He passed it over without question. The blade was only 4 inches long, barely more than a utility tool, but it was sharp, and it was all we had. As the tent wall disintegrated around us, I caught my first clear look at the things that had been hunting us. They were even worse than I'd imagined. Collections of parts that had once been human, recombined into new and horrible configurations. Multiple arms jutted from torsos that were too long and too flexible. Faces appeared and disappeared in their flesh like reflections in dark water, but they moved slowly, carefully, like they were savoring the moment. They knew we had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. They could afford to take their time. That overconfidence saved our lives. I waited until the nearest creature leaned in to grab Jenny, then drove the camping knife deep into what I hoped was something vital. The blade sank into flesh that felt like cold mud, and the thing let out a shriek that shattered my eardrums. Black ichor sprayed from the wound, and where it hit the other creatures, they recoiled as if burned. The injured one thrashed wildly, its form beginning to lose cohesion, melting back into the component parts it had stolen from previous victims. "Run!" I screamed, pushing Jenny and Marcus toward the gap where our tent wall had been. We burst through the circle of creatures before they could react to their companion's distress. The injured one was still thrashing, its death scream echoing through the forest and causing the others to writhe in sympathetic agony. But our reprieve was temporary. Even as we crashed through the undergrowth, I could hear them regrouping behind us. Their voices rose in that alien harmony again, but now there was anger in the sound, a fury that made the very air vibrate. "The car!" Marcus gasped as we ran. "We have to reach the car!" But the forest had changed again. Trees that should have been familiar landmarks were gone or moved. The path we'd followed earlier no longer existed. Worse, the sun seemed to be setting again, despite the fact that it should have been midday. Time, I realized. They're doing something to time. Jenny stumbled, and when Marcus helped her up, I saw the despair in her eyes. We're never getting out of here, are we? This is their place, their rules. Behind us, the pursuit was getting closer. I could hear branches breaking as the creatures forced their way through the forest. Their voices called our names, sometimes in perfect imitations of loved ones, sometimes in tones that promised unimaginable suffering. That's when I remembered something from one of Tom's forum posts, back when I'd still believed he was planning an innocent camping trip. Something about the old Native American name for this area. "Hungry ground," I whispered. The pieces fell into place with horrifying clarity. This wasn't just a random patch of wilderness. It was a feeding ground, a place where these creatures had been luring and consuming travelers for generations. The fire ring wasn't built by campers, it was an altar. The carved symbols weren't graffiti, they were warnings, left by previous victims in their final moments. And Tom had stumbled into this place 3 weeks ago and been taken. Everything since then had been a carefully orchestrated plan to bring more food to the hungry ground. But knowledge, however terrible, was power. If this place operated on supernatural rules, then perhaps those rules could be turned against it. "The knife," I said, pulling it from my pocket. The blade was still covered in that black ichor, and where it had dried, the metal seemed to glow with a faint light. It hurt them, really hurt them. Marcus nodded grimly. Iron. Old folklore always said iron could harm supernatural creatures. "Then we make our stand," Jenny said, her voice steadier than it had been all day. "We can't outrun them, and we can't hide, so we fight." We found a defensible position. A small rise where 3 ancient trees grew close together, their massive trunks forming natural barriers. Marcus and Jenny armed themselves with sharpened branches while I gripped the knife, trying not to think about how pitifully inadequate our weapons were. The creatures emerged from the forest like a tide of nightmares. Dozens of them, all different configurations of stolen human parts, all radiating that same alien intelligence. They surrounded our position but didn't attack immediately, content to watch us with eyes that belonged to people who had probably died decades ago. The Tom thing stepped forward, its form more stable than the others but no less horrifying. When it spoke, the voice carried undertones of every person it had ever consumed. "This is pointless," it said. "You've already lost. Even if you somehow escaped this place, we know where you live. We know your families, your friends, your favorite places. We can be anyone, appear anywhere. You can never truly be safe again." It was probably right, but I didn't care anymore. I was tired of running, tired of being afraid. If these things wanted a fight, I'd give them one. "Maybe," I said, raising the knife, "but you'll have to catch us first." The attack came from all sides at once. Creatures flowed up the slope like water, their forms shifting and changing as they moved. I slashed wildly with the knife, and wherever the blade connected, flesh dissolved and ichor sprayed. Marcus and Jenny fought with desperate efficiency, using their makeshift spears to keep the creatures at bay. But there were too many of them, and they kept coming, reforming even when wounded, adapting to our tactics. A claw raked across my back, shredding my shirt and leaving burning lines of pain. Another creature grabbed Jenny's ankle and she went down hard, her spear flying from her grip. Marcus spun to help her, leaving his side undefended, and something that might once have been human sank its teeth into his shoulder. We were losing. That's when the screaming started. Not from us, not from the creatures attacking us, but from deeper in the forest. A sound of absolute agony that rose above the chaos of our battle and made everything freeze. Through the trees, fire was visible. Real fire. Not the cold blue flames we'd seen in the camp, but honest orange flames that burned with natural heat and light. And silhouetted against those flames was a figure I recognized. Tom. The real Tom, somehow free from the hollow tree where he'd been imprisoned. His body was still wrong, still elongated and twisted, but he was moving under his own power, and in his distorted hands he carried a burning branch like a weapon. The creatures around us recoiled from the light, their forms becoming less solid, less coherent. The Tom thing let out a shriek of rage and pain that might have been in its original voice. "Iron and fire," the real Tom called out, his voice barely human but still recognizably his own. "The old ways, the only ways that work." He stumbled up the slope toward us, leaving a trail of that phosphorescent moss burning behind him. Where the flames touched the creatures, they writhed and dissolved like slugs in salt. "I can't hold this form much longer," Tom gasped as he reached our position. "The change, it's still happening. But I can give you a chance." He pressed the burning branch into my hands. The fire should have burned me, but instead it felt cool and clean, like water after a fever. "The altar," he said. "Destroy the altar. Break their hold on this place." Without another word, he threw himself at the largest group of creatures, his twisted form blazing with that same clean fire. They swarmed over him, but where they touched him, they burned. His screams mixed with theirs as he gave his life to buy us time. We ran for the clearing, the burning branch lighting our way. Behind us, the forest erupted in flames as Tom's sacrifice spread to the ancient trees. The creatures' voices rose in a harmony of pain and rage that followed us through the smoke. The fire ring stood exactly where we'd left it, but now I could see it for what it really was. Not a simple camping convenience, but the focal point of something vast and hungry. The carved symbols pulsed with their own light, and the air above the stones shimmered like heat haze. I didn't hesitate. I drove the burning branch directly into the center of the ring, into the space where countless fires had burned over the centuries, where countless victims had been consumed. The explosion of light was blinding. The carved stones cracked and crumbled, their ancient power finally broken. Through the clearing, I could hear the creatures screaming as their connection to this place was severed. When my vision cleared, the forest was silent again. Not the oppressive silence of predators waiting, but the natural quiet of a place where normal rules applied. Birds were singing, insects buzzed in the underbrush. The air smelled of smoke and rain instead of decay and hunger. We found our car exactly where we'd left it, though the path to reach it was suddenly clear and obvious. Marcus's shoulder needed stitches, and all of us were covered in cuts and bruises, but we were alive. As we drove away from the hungry ground, I looked back once through the rear window. The forest was burning, really burning, consuming the unnatural things that had nested there for so long. With any luck, the fire would spread far enough to cleanse the entire area, but I knew it probably wouldn't matter. There were other places like this one, other feeding grounds where things that had once been human waited for fresh prey. The Tom thing had been right about one thing. We could never truly be safe again. That was 6 months ago. We've all moved since then, changed jobs, tried to build new lives in places far from Louisiana. We don't talk about what happened, not even to each other. What would be the point? But sometimes, late at night, I get phone calls from numbers I don't recognize. When I answer, there's always silence at first. Then, eventually, a voice that sounds exactly like someone I used to know. "Sarah," it says, "I'm lost. Can you help me find my way home?" I always hang up, but I know that someday one of those voices is going to sound convincing enough, desperate enough, human enough that I'll make the mistake of believing it. And when that day comes, I'll disappear just like Tom did, just like countless others before us. The hungry ground is patient. It can wait. It's always been waiting. My name is Sarah Chen, and I am 28 years old. This happened in October 2023. The Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds from the cypress trees as Jake steered our rental car down the narrow gravel road leading into the Kisatchie National Forest. I pressed my face against the passenger window, watching the Louisiana wilderness swallow us whole. Ancient pines towered overhead, their branches interlocking to form a canopy so thick that even at 3 in the afternoon, shadows danced across our windshield like reaching fingers. This trip was supposed to save our relationship. 3 years together, and we'd been circling the drain for the past 6 months. It started with small things. Jake working late more often, me spending weekends at my sister's instead of with him. Then came the bigger fights about money, about his drinking, about whether we wanted the same future. Our last fight had been particularly brutal. I'd accused him of not loving me anymore, and he'd responded by sleeping on the couch for 2 weeks. "Maybe we need some time apart," he'd said one morning over coffee that tasted like ashes in my mouth. Time apart was couple speak for the beginning of the end. I'd seen it happen to all my friends. First the space, then the careful conversations about figuring things out, then the awkward division of belongings and the mutual friends who chose sides. So when Jake suggested this camping trip, just us, no distractions, no cell phones, no work, I'd agreed despite my reservations. I'd never been much for the outdoors. Give me air conditioning and Wi-Fi over mosquitoes and campfires any day, but I was desperate enough to try anything to get back what we'd lost. "GPS says we're still 5 miles from the campsite," Jake said, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. We'd been driving for 2 hours since leaving Alexandria, and the roads had grown progressively smaller and more isolated. "You sure this is the right way?" I checked my phone again. No signal. The screen flickered, showing impossible coordinates that placed us somewhere in the middle of Calcasieu Lake, 40 miles south. "The app's glitching. Just follow the road." The silence between us stretched like a rubber band ready to snap. We used to fill car rides with conversation, terrible singing along to the radio, silly games to pass the time. Now, we could barely manage logistics. I stared out the window at the endless green, remembering when Jake used to reach over and take my hand during long drives. His hands stayed firmly on the wheel now, and mine stayed folded in my lap. The GPS device mounted on our dashboard was equally confused, cycling through satellite searches and showing us as tiny dots floating in empty space. I'd bought it specifically for this trip after reading horror stories about people getting lost in the Louisiana wilderness. Fat lot of good it was doing us now. Jake's jaw tightened. We'd been having problems for months. Fights about work, about money, about the future we couldn't seem to plan together. This camping trip was supposed to fix things. A romantic weekend away from the pressures of our daily lives in Baton Rouge. Now, 3 hours into our drive, the familiar tension was already creeping back. I'd found Longleaf Vista on a camping forum, advertised as Louisiana's best-kept secret, with promises of pristine wilderness and complete isolation. The reviews were glowing. Families talking about magical weekends under the stars, couples rekindling their romance around crackling campfires. One review in particular had sold me. This place will change your relationship forever. Looking back, I should have paid more attention to the single negative review buried at the bottom of the page. User Cajun Truth 87 had written only, "Stay away from Kisatchie after dark. Some hungers never sleep." The review had been posted 3 years ago and marked as spam by the site moderators. I'd barely glanced at it before booking our site. "Maybe we should have picked somewhere closer to civilization," Jake muttered, navigating around a fallen branch. "This place feels like the end of the world." I wanted to argue, to defend my choice, but something about the forest made the words stick in my throat. The trees seemed to lean inward, pressing against the road like they were trying to reclaim it. Spanish moss brushed our roof with soft, scratching sounds that made my skin crawl. The air itself felt different here, heavier, older, like we were breathing in centuries of decay and secrets. We'd planned to camp at Longleaf Vista, a designated site I'd found online that promised pristine wilderness and complete disconnection from modern life. What the website hadn't mentioned was how the silence out here felt alive, watching and waiting. The road curved sharply to the left, and suddenly we were driving alongside Saline Bayou, its dark water reflecting nothing but black sky despite the afternoon sun. The air conditioning struggled against the oppressive humidity that seemed to seep through the car's seals. There, Jake pointed ahead to a small wooden sign barely visible through the undergrowth. Longleaf Vista, 2 miles. The final stretch of road was little more than tire ruts carved through red clay and fallen pine needles. Branches scraped against our windows with sounds like fingernails on glass, and twice Jake had to stop to move fallen logs that blocked our path. The logs were massive, ancient pines that would have taken chainsaws and heavy equipment to move under normal circumstances. Yet they lay across the road as if they'd been placed there deliberately, forcing us to work together to drag them aside. "These things weigh a ton," Jake grunted as we struggled with the second log. "How did they end up perfectly across the road like this?" I didn't answer because I didn't have an answer. The logs showed no signs of storm damage, no splintered ends from falling. They were whole, unbroken, and positioned with mathematical precision to block our path. By the time we reached the campsite, my nerves were frayed and my clothes were soaked with sweat that had nothing to do with the humid Louisiana air. Longleaf Vista was beautiful in a primordial way. A small clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a fire ring made of stacked stones and a weathered picnic table. The website photos hadn't captured the sheer age of this place. The trees were giants, easily 200 years old, their trunks so wide that 3 people holding hands couldn't have encircled them. They formed a perfect circle around the clearing, like ancient sentinels standing guard. The nearest campsite was supposed to be 3 miles away, ensuring the solitude we'd been seeking. But as Jake killed the engine and we sat in the sudden silence, that solitude felt less romantic and more ominous. The silence was absolute. No bird songs, no insect buzz, no rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed muted here, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. "Well," Jake said, forcing cheerfulness into his voice, "at least we'll have privacy." "Well," Jake said, forcing cheerfulness into his voice, "at least we'll have privacy." We set up camp with mechanical efficiency, our conversation reduced to practical necessities. The familiar rhythm of unpacking and organizing should have been comforting, but everything felt wrong here. The tent stakes fought us, bending against what felt like solid rock just inches below the surface. The camp chairs kept tipping over on ground that appeared perfectly level. Even our sleeping bags seemed reluctant to unroll, the zippers sticking and the fabric clinging to itself like it was magnetized. Jake wrestled with the tent stakes while I organized our supplies, checking our provisions against the list I'd made. Everything was there. Enough food for 3 days, water purification tablets, first aid kit, flashlights with extra batteries. I'd packed with the obsessive thoroughness of someone who watched too many survival shows, including emergency flares, a satellite messenger device, and enough protein bars to feed us for a week. But as the afternoon wore on, small things began to go wrong. My phone, which had shown a partial charge when we arrived, was completely dead by 5 o'clock. Not dying, dead, as in completely unresponsive, cold to the touch like it had been stored in a freezer. Jake's iPhone lasted until sunset, then died with a soft electronic sigh even though he'd charged it fully that morning and had been using it sparingly. Our portable radio produced nothing but static, cycling through frequencies that should have picked up stations from Alexandria or Natchitoches. "Must be the trees," Jake said, shaking the radio with increasing frustration. Or maybe solar interference. There was supposed to be solar storm activity this week. The satellite messenger was equally useless, its display showing no signal despite the clear sky above our heads. According to the manual, it should have been able to connect anywhere in North America with an unobstructed view of the sky. But the device's screen remained stubbornly blank, as if the satellites themselves had vanished from orbit. I wanted to believe Jake's explanations. Solar interference was logical, explainable, but the silence that replaced our electronic connection to the outside world felt malevolent, like something had deliberately cut our lifelines. The forest seemed to press closer as our last link to civilization died, and I found myself checking the tree line obsessively. Sure, I could see movement in the shadows between the pines. As darkness fell, the forest came alive with sounds that raised the hair on my arms. Not the expected chirping of crickets or hooting of owls, but stranger noises. A rhythmic tapping like Morse code, branches creaking in patterns too regular to be wind, and underneath it all, a low humming that seemed to come from the earth itself. The humming was the worst part. It was barely audible, more felt than heard, like standing too close to massive electrical transformers. It made my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges. We built a fire as the last light faded from the sky, and that's when we discovered our first real problem. The firewood we'd gathered burned wrong. The flames leaped high and bright, casting dancing shadows against the trees, but the light was all wrong. Instead of the normal warm orange glow, our fire flickered between that and an unsettling green that reminded me of decay, of things that should be buried. The green light made our skin look corpse pale and threw shadows that moved independently of our movements. Jake noticed it too. I saw him staring at the flames with a puzzled frown, holding his hand up to block the green flickers like they physically hurt to look at. "Copper in the wood, maybe?" he suggested, though neither of us really believed it. We'd both been camping before. We knew what wood was supposed to look like when it burned. The smell was wrong too. Instead of the clean, pine-scented smoke we expected, our fire gave off a sweet, cloying odor that reminded me of funeral flowers and old meat. It clung to our clothes and hair, and no amount of repositioning around the fire ring could escape it. I found myself breathing through my mouth to avoid the smell, but I could taste it on my tongue, thick and oily, like the air itself had gone rotten. Dinner was freeze-dried beef stew that tasted like cardboard, but we ate in companionable silence for the first time in months. The fire's warmth pushed back the October chill, and despite the strange flames and stranger sounds, I found myself actually relaxing. The problems in our relationship seemed small and manageable compared to the vast wilderness surrounding us. Maybe this trip would work after all. "Remember when we first met?" Jake asked suddenly, poking at the fire with a stick. "At David's party? You were wearing that blue dress and I spilled beer all over myself trying to introduce myself." I smiled at the memory. "You were so nervous. I thought it was sweet." "I was terrified," he admitted. "You were the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. Still are." For a moment, the old magic was there between us. I could see the man I'd fallen in love with, not the stressed accountant who came home exhausted and distant every night, but the Jake who used to leave little notes in my lunch and surprise me with weekend trips to New Orleans. The Jake who'd once driven 4 hours to bring me soup when I had the flu. "I miss this," I said softly. "I miss us." "Me too." He reached across the space between our camp chairs and took my hand. His fingers were warm from the fire, rough with calluses from the rock climbing he'd given up when work became all-consuming. "I know I've been a terrible boyfriend lately. The promotion, the hours. I lost sight of what matters." "We both did," I admitted. "I was so focused on all the things going wrong that I forgot about everything going right." He squeezed my hand, and for a few precious minutes we talked like we used to. About our future, about the house we wanted to buy, about the trip to Ireland we'd been planning for 2 years but never quite managed to take. The strange sounds of the forest faded into background noise as we reconnected, our voices mingling with the crackle of burning wood. But then a sound from the darkness beyond our fire made us both freeze. A long, mournful wail that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It started low, almost below the range of human hearing, then climbed to a piercing shriek that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. The sound had a quality that was human-like but wrong, as if someone was trying to remember how to scream but had forgotten the right pitch, the right rhythm. "Coyote," Jake said quickly, but his voice shook and his hand tightened on mine with painful intensity. "Just a coyote." But we both knew it wasn't. I'd heard coyotes before, during camping trips with my family in East Texas. This was something else entirely, something that had learned to mimic the sounds of pain and fear, but couldn't quite get it right. The call came again, closer this time, and I could hear movement in the underbrush. Heavy bodies crashing through the forest in a way that suggested either something very large or several somethings moving in coordination. We sat closer together, feeding the fire until it blazed high enough to illuminate the nearest trees. In that wavering, green-tinged light, I could have sworn I saw shapes moving between the pines. Tall, impossibly thin figures that seemed to melt back into the darkness whenever I looked directly at them. They moved wrong, like they weren't quite familiar with the mechanics of locomotion, each step too deliberate, too careful. "Sarah," Jake's voice was barely a whisper, "look at our food." I turned toward our supplies and gasped. The packages of food we'd carefully arranged on the picnic table were covered in a thick gray mold that hadn't been there an hour ago. The mold pulsed and writhed like it was alive, spreading even as I watched. It covered our freeze-dried meals, our energy bars, our carefully packed trail mix. The smell hit me then, sweet and rotten, like fruit left too long in the sun, mixed with something else, something that reminded me of my grandfather's funeral, of flowers wilting in a closed casket. "That's impossible," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I watched the mold spread, creeping across our sleeping bags and backpacks like a living thing. Jake stood abruptly, grabbing a flashlight from his pack. The beam cut through the darkness but seemed weaker than it should have been, creating more shadows than it banished. "We need to leave. Now." But when we turned toward where we'd parked the car, there was nothing but empty forest. No tire tracks, no disturbed ground where our vehicle had been. Just trees and darkness stretching endlessly in every direction. "The car," Jake said stupidly, spinning in a circle with his flashlight. "Where's the car?" I felt reality tilt and slide like water down a drain. We'd parked 30 feet from the fire ring. I could trace our exact steps from the car to our campsite, but there was no sign it had ever existed. "Maybe we're confused about the direction," I said, though even as I spoke I could feel the lie in the words. "It's dark, and we're scared. We'll find it in the morning." But Jake was backing toward the fire, his light sweeping frantically across the trees. "Sarah, look at the time." I checked my watch, the old analog Timex my grandfather had given me, the one that never needed batteries. The hands pointed to 3:17, but I couldn't tell if that was AM or PM. The numbers seemed to swim before my eyes, rearranging themselves even as I watched. "How long have we been out here?" Jake asked. I tried to remember. We'd arrived in the afternoon, set up camp, cooked dinner as the sun set. But now that I thought about it, I couldn't remember the sun actually setting. One moment it had been day, and then suddenly it was full dark with no twilight between. The fire popped and sent sparks spiraling upward, and in that brief flare of light, I saw something that made my blood freeze. On the far side of the clearing, barely visible at the edge of our firelight, stood a figure. It was tall, too tall, and thin in a way that hurt to look at. Its arms hung at impossible angles, and its head tilted to one side like a bird studying prey. But it was the face that made me grab Jake's arm hard enough to bruise. It had features, human features, but they were wrong. Eyes set too wide apart, a mouth that stretched too far across its skull. "Do you see it?" I whispered. Jake followed my gaze and went rigid. "What the hell is that?" The thing, because I couldn't think of it as anything human, took a step forward, then another. Its movement was all wrong, like someone had described walking to it but it had never seen it done. "We need more wood for the fire," Jake said, his voice strangely calm. "It doesn't like the light." He was right. The creature stayed just at the edge of our firelight, swaying slightly like a tree in the wind. But our supply of firewood was already running low. "I'll get some," Jake said, picking up his hatchet. "There's plenty of deadfall just beyond those trees." "No." I grabbed his arm. "Don't leave the fire. We stay together." But Jake was already moving, his flashlight beam sweeping toward the tree line. "I'll be quick. Keep the fire bright. Jake, please." He kissed my forehead, and for a moment he felt like the man I'd fallen in love with 3 years ago. "It's going to be okay, Sarah. I promise." And then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness beyond our small circle of light. I fed the fire every piece of wood I could find, watching the flames leap and dance while my ears strained for the sound of Jake's return. The creature across the clearing had vanished when Jake left, but I could feel it watching from somewhere in the darkness. Minutes crawled by like hours. I called Jake's name, softly at first, then louder when there was no response. The forest swallowed my voice without even an echo, as if the sound simply ceased to exist the moment it left my lips. I tried shouting, screaming his name until my throat was raw, but the silence that followed was absolute and somehow mocking. Then I heard the hatchet, the steady thunk, thunk, thunk of metal biting into wood. The sound came from my left, deeper in the forest than Jake should have gone for simple deadfall. The rhythm was familiar, Jake's rhythm, the way he approached any physical task with methodical precision. 3 quick strikes, pause to reposition, 3 more strikes. I'd watched him split wood at his parents' cabin enough times to recognize his technique, but something about the sound made my skin crawl. It was too regular, too mechanical, like a machine rather than a man working, and it went on too long. Jake was efficient with an axe, but this chopping continued for what felt like an hour without pause. No human could maintain that pace without rest, without variation in the timing. "Jake," I called, "I can hear you chopping. Are you okay?" The chopping stopped. Silence stretched for what felt like hours. Then I heard footsteps moving through the underbrush, heavy, deliberate steps that cracked twigs and rustled through fallen leaves. Coming closer. The footsteps had the same mechanical quality as the chopping. Too regular, too evenly spaced, lacking the natural variation of human gait. "Sarah!" Jake's voice drifted from the darkness. "Sarah, I need help. I'm hurt." Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by fear. His voice sounded wrong, flat, emotionless, like he was reading from a script he didn't understand. But it was definitely Jake's voice, Jake's inflection, and he said he was hurt. "Where are you? I can't see you," I called back, grabbing my flashlight and standing. "Here." His voice was closer now, just beyond the firelight. "I cut myself with the hatchet. It's bad." I pointed my flashlight beam toward his voice, sweeping it back and forth across the edge of the clearing. The light caught him just at the edge of the darkness, and my heart nearly stopped. It was Jake. His face, his clothes, his sandy hair that always stuck up in the back no matter how much gel he used. But something was terribly wrong. He stood perfectly straight despite claiming to be hurt, his arms hanging loose at his sides like a rag doll's. His face was pale in the LED light, but it was his eyes that made me take a step backward. They reflected the beam like an animal's, throwing back a sickly yellow glow that shouldn't have been possible with human eyes. And he was smiling. Jake never smiled like that. It was too wide, too constant, like someone had carved it into his face with a knife. The expression never wavered, never changed, just that horrible rictus grin that showed too many teeth. And he wasn't blinking. I watched for 30 seconds as he stood there with that terrible smile, and he didn't blink once. "Come, help me," he said, his voice still flat and emotionless despite the grin. "I'm bleeding." But I couldn't see any blood. His clothes were clean, his hands unmarked. The white t-shirt he'd worn for the drive was spotless, not a stain or tear anywhere. If he'd cut himself badly enough to need help, there should have been evidence. Blood on his clothes, on his hands, somewhere. "Where's the wood?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He tilted his head to one side, exactly like the creature had done. The movement was too sharp, too quick, inhuman in its precision. "What wood?" "The firewood. You went to get firewood." For a moment his smile faltered, and something passed across his features. Confusion, maybe, or frustration. It was like watching a mask slip, revealing something else underneath. "I don't remember firewood." The fire popped behind me, sending up a shower of sparks, and in that brief flare I saw what stood in the darkness behind Jake. The tall, thin creature was still there, but now there were others. Dozens of them, standing motionless between the trees like a forest of nightmares. They were all different heights, different builds, but they shared that same impossible thinness, that same wrong proportion that hurt to look at directly. And they were all watching us with eyes that reflected the firelight like mirrors. "Jake," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice steady, "come into the light, by the fire." He took a step forward, and I saw that his feet didn't quite touch the ground. He moved like something was carrying him, like a puppet on invisible strings. Each step was perfectly measured, perfectly placed, without the natural variation of human movement. It was like watching someone who had learned to walk by studying a manual rather than by actually experiencing it. "Sarah," he said, and now his voice had a pleading quality that almost broke my heart. "Don't you want to help me? Don't you love me anymore?" It was Jake's voice, Jake's face, Jake's way of making me feel guilty when I didn't immediately give him what he wanted. But the thing wearing them wasn't him. I understood that with sudden, horrible clarity. My Jake was gone, dead, consumed, transformed into something else. And this thing had put on his appearance like a costume it was still learning to wear. I backed away from the fire toward the picnic table where I'd left my knife. The camping blade was nothing against these creatures, but it was sharp, and it was something. Behind me, I could hear the fire burning lower, the wood almost exhausted. Soon, there would be nothing but darkness. "We can be together forever," it said. "In the dark, in the quiet. No more fighting, no more pain." My hand closed around the knife handle. A simple camping blade, nothing that could fight off whatever these things were. But it was sharp, and it was something. "Where is he?" I demanded. "What did you do with Jake?" The smile stretched wider, impossibly wide, until it split the thing's cheeks. "He's safe. He's quiet now. He doesn't hurt anymore." Behind it, the other creatures began to move, flowing between the trees like smoke. They made no sound, but I could feel their presence pressing against my mind like cold fingers. The fire was burning low. Soon there would be nothing but darkness. "Join him," the Jake thing whispered, extending one hand toward me. "Join us. It's so peaceful here, so quiet." I looked at that outstretched hand and saw that the fingers were too long, the joints bending in directions that human bones couldn't manage. Whatever this thing was, it had been wearing Jake's appearance like a mask, and the mask was starting to slip. "No," I said, gripping the knife tighter. The smile vanished. "No?" I said no. I backed further away, feeling the heat of the fire against my legs. "You're not Jake. You're nothing like Jake." The thing's head tilted again, and when it spoke, its voice was no longer trying to imitate my boyfriend. It was hollow, ancient, hungry. "Then you will join him differently." It lunged forward with inhuman speed, but I was ready. I spun away from its grasping hands and dove toward the fire, grabbing a burning branch from the flames. The thing shrieked and recoiled as I swung the makeshift torch at its face. Fire. They hated fire. I grabbed another branch, building myself an arsenal of flame while the creatures hissed and retreated to the edges of the clearing. But I couldn't maintain a circle of fire forever. Eventually, the wood would run out. That's when I saw him. Jake, the real Jake, stumbled into the clearing from the opposite direction, his shirt torn and bloodied, his face pale with shock. He carried an armload of firewood and his hatchet, exactly as he'd promised. "Sarah," he gasped. "What the hell is that thing?" I looked back and forth between the two Jakes, one retreating from my fire, the other approaching with wood to feed it. They looked identical except for the wounds, the fear, the very human confusion on the second Jake's face. "Prove it," I said, holding my torch between us. "Prove you're really Jake." He dropped the wood and held up his hands. "Sarah, it's me. What do you want me to say?" "Tell me something only Jake would know." The false Jake had stopped retreating and was watching this exchange with interest, that terrible smile returning to its face. "Our first fight," real Jake said desperately. "Last Christmas, when I wanted to spend it with my parents and you wanted to stay home. You threw a coffee mug at my head and missed, and it broke your grandmother's picture frame. You cried for an hour because you thought it meant we were going to break up." I wanted to believe him. Every detail was perfect, exactly as it had happened. But then I noticed his feet, and my heart sank. Like the other one, he wasn't quite touching the ground. "Very good," the first Jake thing said, its voice now a horrible parody of my boyfriend's. "Did we pass the test?" I realized with mounting horror that there were now 3 of them, then 4. More Jakes emerging from the darkness, each one perfect in every detail except for those few tells. The floating, the too wide smile, the eyes that never blinked. They'd been listening, learning, perfecting their mimicry, and somewhere in this nightmare forest, the real Jake was probably dead. "Sarah," one of them said in a voice so achingly familiar it brought tears to my eyes. "Why are you running from us? We love you. We just want to be close to you. Forever." The fire was almost out. A few more minutes and I'd be defenseless in the dark with these things that wore my boyfriend's face like masks. That's when I remembered something my grandfather had told me about the old forests of Louisiana. Stories passed down from his Creole grandmother about creatures that lived in the deep woods, things that could steal your shape and voice and memories. He'd called them the hunger, spirits that fed on loneliness and despair. "You can't have us both," I said, raising my chin with false bravado. "You can't take me and keep him. That's not how it works." The creatures tilted their heads in unison like a pack of hunting dogs. "Why not?" "Because the stories say so. The old stories. You can take one or the other, but not both. That's the rule." I was making it up, grasping at half-remembered folklore, but something in their posture changed. Uncertainty flickered across their stolen features. "Choose," I continued, pressing my advantage. "Take me and let him go, or keep him and let me leave." The creatures exchanged glances, a disturbingly human gesture from things that were decidedly not human. Then one of them, the first one I'd seen, stepped forward. "We choose both," it said. They attacked simultaneously, rushing toward me from all sides. I swung my torch desperately, but there were too many of them. Cold hands grabbed my arms, my shoulders, my throat. The knife was torn from my grip, but as their fingers touched my skin, something unexpected happened. They recoiled with screams of pain, their perfect Jake faces contorting into expressions of agony. Where they'd touched me, their skin began to smoke and blacken. I looked down at my hands and saw they were glowing with a soft, warm light that seemed to come from within. The cross necklace my grandmother had given me was burning with the same gentle radiance. "Iron," I breathed. "You can't touch iron." My grandmother's cross was made of iron, and apparently, so was something else I carried. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my keys. Old-fashioned iron keys to the house I'd inherited from my grandfather. The creatures backed away, hissing and spitting like angry cats. Their Jake faces were melting now, revealing the horrible truth underneath. Skulls stretched too long, eye sockets that held only darkness, mouths full of needle teeth. I clutched the keys and cross and ran. The forest seemed to shift around me as I fled, paths appearing and disappearing, trees moving when I wasn't looking directly at them. But the iron light guided me, cutting through the supernatural darkness like a beacon. Behind me, the things gave chase, but they couldn't come too close. I heard them crashing through the underbrush, keeping pace but maintaining their distance, waiting for me to stumble, to drop my protection, to make one fatal mistake. I ran for what felt like hours, guided only by instinct and the faint glow of metal in my hands. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't dare stop. Not until I saw the most beautiful sight in the world, electric lights cutting through the darkness ahead. The road. I'd found the road. A truck was coming toward me, its headlights blazing like salvation. I stumbled into the middle of the pavement, waving my arms frantically. The driver, a middle-aged man in a hunting cap, slammed on his brakes and rolled down his window. "Jesus, lady, what are you doing out here? Are you hurt?" I looked back toward the forest. The creatures had stopped at the tree line, unable or unwilling to approach the modern road with its electric lights and iron guardrails. They stood in the shadows between the trees, wearing Jake's face, watching me with ancient hunger. "My boyfriend," I gasped. "He's still in there. We need to call for help." The man's expression grew grim. "How long you been in those woods?" "Since yesterday afternoon. Maybe... I'm not sure." He checked his watch. "Lady, it's Thursday morning. You've been missing for 3 days." 3 days? But that was impossible. We'd only been camping for 1 night. The search and rescue teams found our campsite exactly where I'd left it. Our tent was still standing, our supplies scattered and covered in mold. But they never found Jake, despite searching for 2 weeks with dogs and helicopters and thermal imaging. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead. Exposure, most likely, or a fall in the dark. The authorities were kind but skeptical of my story about creatures in the woods. The therapist they recommended was even more skeptical. But I know what I saw. And sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in my apartment, I hear a familiar voice calling from the darkness outside my window. Jake's voice, pleading with me to come out, to come back to the forest where we can be together forever. I've changed all my locks to iron deadbolts. I wear my grandmother's cross every day, and I never, ever go camping anymore. Because somewhere in the Kisatchie National Forest, something is still wearing my boyfriend's face, still using his voice to call for help. And I know that if I ever go back, if I ever let my guard down, I'll join him in that terrible quiet darkness where the hunger waits between the trees. The therapist says I'm suffering from survivor's guilt, that I've created a supernatural explanation for a tragic but mundane disappearance. She's probably right. But she's never heard Jake calling my name from the shadows. She's never seen his face smiling that too wide smile in her dreams. And she doesn't know that every morning when I wake up, there are muddy footprints on my fire escape that weren't there the night before. Footprints that match Jake's hiking boots exactly.